Dinosaurs are indisputably cool, right? From Jurassic Park to Brock's Rocks to Dinosaucers and even Denver the Last Dinosaur, my childhood was dominated by prehistoric creatures. I had a whole collection of little rubber neon figurines, a 3-foot-tall Dilophosaurus plush, and even a dinosaur joke book. But all phases of interest must end, and while I'd be lying if I said I didn't still enjoy the majesty and mystery of these Mesozoic monsters, there was a definite finale to their tenure within my brain. A last one out gets the lights mentality that held hands with my evergreen passion for fighting games while tagging out to my preteen interest in over-the-top brutality.
Primal Rage.
I'm EHRGEIZ, and welcome to Violent Profiles, where we discuss obscure fighting games and the rosters that define them. I don't remember where exactly I first ran into Atari's prehistoric platform for pugilism. To me, the meeting was less important than the game itself. The premise was simple. A crashing meteor has undone civilization and returned Earth to a prehistoric era where godlike apes and dinosaurs battle for supremacy. Even with a roster of only 7 characters, I spent a lot of time with this game, cataloging different moves, trying in vain to do the temperamental fatalities on my SNES cart, and, of course, playing a little human volleyball. What I remember most fondly, however, is using the skills I honed at home in the arcade to school a couple of shocked teenagers several years my senior as my father looked on in pride. My character of choice for that fight was Armadon, one of the 4 virtuous beasts whose goal was to keep peace on Earth and protect it against destruction. He was the last to emerge from his subterranean slumber, disturbed by all the fighting due to his connection to the planet's life force and energy flow. He mostly resembles a bipedal Chasmosaurus with extra spikes, a long tail, and a Thagomizer. Side note, as a fan of the Far Side from early childhood, can I just take a minute to enjoy the fact that not only is the commonly used informal name for the spiked end of a Stegosaurus tail based on one of Gary Larson's comics, but it's described that way on the Primal Rage wiki? Glorious. I think what young me enjoyed about Armadon was his simple combos and diverse special moves. It made him feel very well-rounded. I can also appreciate that after whipping all the other dinosaurs into paste, he just goes back to sleep underground like so much grumpy grandpa.
Get off my lawn.
Another quick aside, when I first conceived of relaunching Violent Profiles, I had plans to record all this footage myself. The fact that I didn't is down to the happenstance that I wanted to cover this game first. The arcade iteration of Primal Rage was my choice for what you see on screen, since while I primarily played the Super Nintendo version in my youth, the arcade graphics are so much better. Except that MAME didn't want to cooperate with my capture software, and there's the other sticky wicket of the hard-coded anti-piracy features. Characters might trip for no good reason, gravity and attack timing becomes absurd, and as you've probably noticed, the blood sometimes turns into Dijon mustard.
Pardon me? Would you have any Grey Poupon?
This copy protection was so aggressive that it persists in what were supposed to be perfect ports in 2 Midway Arcade Treasures collections. I'm given to understand there's a PC version that looks pretty good, but we've crossed the Rubicon on that particular subject. Fight footage would take less time to collect from the internet, and better yet, the people playing the games would actually look like they knew how. I'm unlikely to mention it again, so just remember, if you're ever impressed by what you see on screen, credits are in the description. Most of my time on the SNES was spent with Talon, a speedy velociraptor-like dinosaur with a mane of feathers, though playing him today I'm not sure why. He's faster than the rest of the roster, but his specials are mostly excruciatingly short range, and his run ability takes way too many button inputs to feel worth moving a bit more quickly. I also don't know why I thought he was a girl. The story even said he was the chief of the raptor clans and had many wives. Maybe I was really into hot lesbian raptor action.
It's sexual, baby. And I want to give it all to you.
I was not. That was a joke. Anyhow, Talon hails from a hidden island in the South Pacific that was brought into contact with the rest of the world from the meteor strike. Though he's considered one of the heroic virtuous beasts, Talon mostly wants peace and paradise for his people. I guess defensive xenophobia is more virtuous than, say, world domination. Speaking of world domination, the red and black Tyrannosaurus Diablo was released from the bowels of the earth by the Cataclysm and seeks to turn the world into a raging inferno of suffering. His own personal vision of hell, with him as the devil on the throne. I personally always pictured my apocalyptic bringers of ruin with bigger arms, but whatever works. Maybe that's the reason I never really used Diablo, or perhaps it's just the somewhat awkward hitboxes of his normals. Bonus points for having a teleport, though. Let's move on from someone who can't punch to someone who punches quite a lot. I feel like I slept on Blizzard as a youngster because I've never been a big fan of primates, and his cover boy status triggered the "if it's popular it must be lame" reaction in me. That was a mistake. This monkey has reach, some really satisfying command grabs, and Sub-Zero style ice powers to freeze your enemy in place. His moves are among the most intuitive in the game, and he's got decent motivations as the deity of nobility and wisdom. Being set free from his glacial prison by the meteor, Blizzard stomps down from his mountain home to restore the world to order before returning to stand watch as a philosopher guardian. And come on, what a great look! A more lithe King Kong with a feral, almost baboon-like face and really crisp coloration keeps Blizzard from looking like a dopey monkey and grants legitimacy to his status as an unfrozen simian god. After moving on from Armadon, and before my futile efforts at mastering Talon, my controller belonged to the hypnotic gaze of the Serpentine Vertigo. Playing her today, I think she'd probably be my main. First off, check out that look, that color scheme! 1994 me loved the Charlotte Hornets, so I was vibing with the teal and purple. She also had easy-to-remember moves, including hot pink projectiles, a stun, a hook, and reach for days in her normals. Plus, for a burgeoning young edgelord, being the goddess of insanity, the moon, and dark sorcery drew me to her even more. She was sealed away inside the moon by the archmage Balsaphas and released by the shockwaves from the Cataclysm. After defeating the other gods, she uses the minds of the hapless humans remaining on Earth for her dark experiments, shredding them into madness and forcing them to build her a twisted palace that exists in multiple dimensions. Holy shit, I am using this as the basis for a Dungeons & Dragons villain, like, immediately! Let's talk about the two palette swap fighters, the first of which being the yellow and purple counterpart to Diablo, Sauron. Despite being listed as one of the supposedly heroic virtuous beasts, Sauron is not only named for the Dark Wizard main antagonist from the Lord of the Rings, but is also the god of hunger who must sustain his immortality by devouring human flesh. He thrives on war and battles the other deities, so he has absolute right to eat their worshippers. That doesn't particularly sound like a good guy to me, but what do I know? I'm not a dinosaur. I don't care for either Tyrannosaur, but I think I prefer Diablo's special moves to Sauron. Neat ideas with hot pink stunning roars, but the execution's a little rough. Finally, we have Chaos. Chaos was not originally a gargantuan ape god, instead beginning life as either a skilled geneticist who coveted Blizzard's powers, or a ruthless witch doctor who wanted to control humanity's evolution. Maybe both? As part of his quest, he cast a diabolical spell, or did a diabolical science experiment that backfired and turned him into a giant monkey, which forced him to live in his own filth and excrement until the meteor struck. Chaos said a prayer to the god of Carrion for release from his curse and was set forth to destroy the other dino gods. Win the game with this pink-furred monkey and he'll return to his buff, Frazetta-esque human form and be granted rule of Earth. Much like Sauron, Chaos's specials feel a bit inferior to his blue counterpart and are often harder to execute. However, the stun effects are a nice touch, and playing a monkey who farts, pees, and pukes on his enemies is the height of comedy for some folks. Chaos is probably the character most known from Primal Rage who didn't play the game before the controversy in the presence of top 100 ridiculous fighting game finishers video listicles. His golden shower fatality caused such uproar from concerned parents that the games were pulled from Best Buy shelves and the move was censored in future releases. No real loss, but still interesting to see how something so small could spark so many bunched pairs of underwear less than 20 years ago. I suppose the character's in-game actions causing mass hysteria in real life is living up to his name.
Chaos Control!
Primal Rage had an immediate and legitimate impact, so much so that by 1995 there was a 4-issue comic book miniseries, and later a 1997 novelization called Primal Rage: The Avatars, which I dimly recall reading years ago and finding underwhelming. It was intended to bridge the gap between the original game and a sequel, where the characters from the first game were sealed away and had to fight through human avatars who could only temporarily morph into the gods. 2 new characters would be included, Slashfang the Smilodon and Necrosan, a zombie dragon boss who was cut from the original release, as well as the humanoid forms of each god. Unfortunately, Primal Rage 2 was cancelled during development because of a buyout by Mortal Kombat publisher Midway and a story better told by Matt McMuscles. Still, much like a lot of the games you'll see covered on this show, Primal Rage had a great core concept and decent gameplay. One has to wonder what the fighting game landscape would look like today if this game had risen to the likes of Killer Instinct or Samurai Showdown.
In the not-too-distant future, the United States has fallen as all great empires eventually do. The techno-industrial civil wars have shattered the 50 states into individual territories run by the megacorporations known as the GI Corps. Neo-America rises from a government too financially bankrupt to maintain control and from tech companies too morally bankrupt to be stopped. It's a land of white-collar espionage, high technology, and bioengineering maintained only by the Secret Games Commission and its constant battle tournaments for control of Neo-America. Each GI Corp has its own champion, one of the biological, flying, robotic-enhanced, armored-killing synthoids, the Bio-Freaks.
Damn, that's cool. How is that the storyline for this game?
Welcome to Neo America, citizen.
I'm Eric J. Chucky, and welcome to Violent Profiles, where we discuss obscure fighting games and the rosters that define them. Now, don't get me wrong, F.R.E.A.K.S has a lot going for it, including Midway's fighting game pedigree. It also has enough against it that we're not currently swimming in F.R.E.A.K.S sequels. A game of gory dismemberment in the vein of Time Killers and Bloodstorm, F.R.E.A.K.S embraced the jump into the third dimension, as was on trend for the N64 era. That was where I played the game back in the day, to be clear, though this footage is from the graphically superior PlayStation version. Admittedly, the plot sounds pretty typical for the grimdark fare of the late 90s, but having lived through 2020, it feels oddly contemporary now. And as schlocky as it is, I've read plenty of fighting game setups that were a lot worse. There's also more story to each fighter and the world of the game itself than you might expect, which is great for me because that's the premise of this show. Each of the fighters in F.R.E.A.K.S is a synthoid, a lab-bred, genetically endowed, their term not mine, killing machine who's basically Wolverine with enough cyberware stuffed into him to run Microsoft Flight Simulator on max settings. Instead of that, however, they're controlled through a biodrive full of expert combat strategies. So remember that next time someone tries to beat you by spamming low kick. That's canonically a god-tier fighting technique. The tissue regeneration feature doesn't last forever though, and if a synthoid loses a limb after this fades, they have to retrofit more cybernetic parts onto them. These synthoids are thus fittingly called retros. If a retro gets to the point that their body is
more machine than man,
they become what's called a dozer, nothing more than a brain and a mechanical chassis that lacks any free will or self-control. This being a process that ultimately culminates in humanoid ownership has led to the rise of the Freak Underground, a resistance movement dedicated to liberating synthoids and gaining them equal rights. The Secret Games Commission fears this will undermine their efforts to unify Neo America and return the country to splintered warring states. This brings us to the Freaks themselves, and let's start with the guy everyone knows, our man on the cover, Zipperhead. You wouldn't think he's a good guy by looking at him, but after losing a battle to fellow freak Bullseye that saw his limbs replaced with weapons and his humanity chipped away, Zip had an emotional breakdown and ripped the biodrive from his skull, freeing himself from the GI Corp that owned him to join the Freak Underground. DNA Advancement Laboratories, Zipperhead's manufacturer, blamed an imperfection in their biodrives that was known to allow for independent thought, and has since improved those drives for future models. I really love that tidbit there, mentioning the PR process DNA Advancement Labs took to try and recoup their losses on Zip's very public defection. Really sells me on the dystopia. I always find it interesting what kind of moves the cover star has, because I feel like it sets the standards of expectation for the rest of the game. Zipperhead has a lot of projectiles with his bullets and buzzsaws, and a few cool ways to clear ground and blow up opponents with incredibly destructive short-range attacks once he gets in close. I think the standout is his tornado that launches the enemy into the air in sort of a stun state. Nothing new to the genre, but certainly unique for our man Zip. Now, ordinarily here I would go into what happens in each character's ending, but they don't have endings. When you finish the game, it just displays their bios from the manual. On one hand, that's very lame. We worked so hard with a character we enjoyed only to earn something we already had. But then again, for most fighters, all their success means is that some shadowy, corrupt megacorporation slides into power. There's no conclusion to be had for any story. In fact, there's rarely a story compelling these characters to fight beyond GI Corp said so, Zipperhead being an exception. So like if Sapo wins the tournament, for example, New Mexico would take control of Neo America and further their interests, but Zipperhead is part of the Freak Underground. Does that mean they successfully destabilized the Secret Games Commission? Do synthoids have rights now? Nobody knows. It looks cool though, right? Speaking of Sapo, he's the only freak classified as a mutate, because I guess all the other GI Corps were making humans, and this renegade group of underground New Mexican scientists were the only ones who thought, what if we made a bitchin' toad monster? Which basically sounds like me every time I make a Dungeons & Dragons character. This warty goon has a bear trap for a mouth and does a lot of bounding around and shooting slime balls as part of his attacks. His basic 2-kick combo feels satisfying to execute, and he also teleports and fires a second bear trap out of his lamprey arm thing to chew on his prey or drag them in for more punishment. With this arsenal, Sapo won New Mexico's independence from Microgene's Texas annex that once controlled them. Wait, that sounds suspiciously like an ending. In fact, more than one bio in the manual mentions stuff that sounds like it should only be revealed as part of the character's ending. Did these things happen in previous tournaments, or are they events that took place during this one? If that's the case, why are these secret endings described right there in the manual? Bizarre. Sabotage is another one of the freaks with a secret ending tidbit that she was made by DNA Advancement Labs and is thus a sibling of her most hated rival Zipperhead, although neither she nor we know this. Sabotage is a veteran of the Nevada-California State Conglomerate Police Force in the Violent Crime Department. She currently works for the Secret Games Commission as a killer for hire, trying to track down and eliminate members of the Freak Underground as well as human supremacists who call themselves true breeds. She's certainly well equipped to accomplish this, with multiple types of ammo for her gun she can swap between in battle, different ways to stun the opponent, floating mine traps, and a badass Taekwondo-inspired set of melee attacks. It's too bad she's a little visually underwhelming for my tastes. I might have played her more back in the day. Maybe it's her default color palette, though the purple top Player 2 gets isn't any more inspiring. She's definitely got Sonya Blade, Lara Croft vibes, and I can see how she'd be someone's favorite. Let's move on to Minitech, which is simultaneously the best and worst name you could choose for your robot Minotaur. One of the first synthoids created by GI Corp Microgene for the battle pits, he was instrumental in securing Kentucky and Illinois for their empire. Sometime after he became a dozer, he was purchased by Missouri and further altered by the Anheuser Robotics Company. The names of these GI Corps, man, I love it. Minitech feels almost unfair to control. While everyone has a vast array of special moves to deploy, his seem like some of the least avoidable and most devastating, or maybe they're just more satisfying to unleash. Goring your opponents, firing missile salvos, sweeping your flail around, exhaling smoke and flame. If he's not OP, he's at least fun as hell. Despite being a lab-bred human brain in a robot bullman body, Minitech is still capable of independent thought and has been caught considering joining the Freak Underground. Anheuser Robotics was working on a free will nullifying biodrive, but Microgene beat him to the punch, so they stopped trying. Truly, being able to comment first on your mind-enslaving tech development is far more important than stopping the literal rampaging bull in your laboratory from deciding to go into business for himself. From the whole bull to just its peepers, let's talk about the genetic combination of Duke Nukem and Colonel Guile, Bullseye. He spells his name with a Z because it's 1998 and that's very cool. This lineage has allowed him to remain a pure synthoid even after all his years of combat, a prototype from Microgene who is unerringly loyal to the Secret Games Commission and its ambassador, believing the only way to bring peace and justice to Neo America is through battling in the pit. Wait a minute. He's Peacemaker.
If this whole beach was completely covered in dicks, and somebody said I'd eat every dick until the beach was clean for liberty, I would say no problemo.
Bullseye is all about smacking you around with his bayonet arms, leaping around the screen while shooting both guns, and lobbing both grenades and timed explosives. He feels better to control than I expected him to, and there's a smoothness to a lot of his attacks that some of the bigger, more weapons-laden freaks lack. My favorite part about Bullseye, though, is that for all his bluster and dedication to being a victorious champion of the pit, all he really wants is to become human. That's either incredibly endearing and gives this rough and tumble soldier type an unexpected layer of compelling vulnerability, or he just really wants to qualify for access to the True Breed rallies. They have the best tiki torches after all. Purge is a retro from Utah, which is controlled by a rebellious former subsidiary of Microgene known as NewCell. This has created a fierce rivalry between Texas and Utah since Purge was built with proprietary information originally belonging to Microgene. Texas insists Purge should belong to them, Utah argues that they built him, and the Chief Games Commissioner doesn't seem to give a shit either way. Wait, how do normal citizens feel about all this secret game stuff? Is it actually a secret? Is it like Slay Industries, where they watch the fights fanatically on TV, sporting jerseys for their favorite tech company that match the boots held firmly to their necks? Never a vanilla synthoid, Purge was grafted with his propeller flamethrower arms immediately after his creation, which may explain why he's so comfortable using those massive slap chops to blenderize his opponents and spew flame everywhere. He's got sort of a graceful, acrobatic feel to his attacks. It really lets him stand out and makes you feel like the designers gave a shit about what they were creating. Purge is described as the most intelligent freak and was programmed with a disregard for his own personal safety, making him literally a fearless competitor. If Sabotage draws parallels to Sonya Blade, Delta is clearly more inspired by Bee Orchid from Killer Instinct. That resemblance is mostly superficial, however, and as soon as you get her into the pit, she looks more along the lines of a cyberpunk fairy. Like the kind you'd expect to see tattooed on the calf of a girl who seems really cool, but is actually really toxic. Or maybe on the side of a van. Do people still paint cool shit on the sides of their vans? Can we bring that back? Delta is described as the fastest freak, but that doesn't really come through in her gameplay. She's certainly the most poised, using her blade something like a fencer. She also possesses a few special moves that see her twirling and floating along the battlefield like a pixie whose swords turn into lasers, and also she shoots ghosts at you who steal your life force. No explanation on what those ghosts are. Computer viruses? Actual spirit energy she harnesses to attack her foes? Is magic real in Neo-America? Delta is also described as female, which I had deduced from her massive bongalarahongadonkadoos, but you know, it's nice to have confirmation. She hails from Indiana, Michigan, and was created by Detroit's own General Genetics. Much like many of her fellow Secret Games participants, despite having a chip in her head that controls her actions, she's an idealist rumored to have friends in the Freak Underground. She's previously battled Minitech and fallen to him, but instead of getting the cybernetic weapons that would make her a retro, she got humanoid prosthetics to preserve the look of her body. Which makes sense because the manual states, because of her incredible winning rack, she gets many perks. Oh, winning track. My bad. You can see how I'd get confused since, you know, nobody in the history of time has ever phrased it that way before or since. Cyclown is the kind of character I'd be immediately drawn to these days. He's a terrible little honk man who battles exclusively for the state of Illinois and its controlling interest, Chicago Technetics. Born in a cloning lab called Duplications Unlimited that's quickly climbing the ranks in the made-to-order clone industry, Cyclown is rumored to be bred from the CEO's dead son, given enhanced senses and a constant surge of adrenaline to keep him tweaked out at all times. This is, perhaps, an attempt to keep him from carrying out his own personal goal, to punish the man who created him in grisly fashion. As you'd expect, most of Cyclown's moves involve circus props, including chattering teeth, bouncy balls, a big novelty hammer, and dynamite tied to balloons. What you might not expect are the circus fleas that toss your opponent around, or the Captain America-style shield you can throw and slice with. He has an interesting moveset of command grabs and traps less focused on bullets and bombs that help him stand out from the rest of the roster. And while his normals are nothing to write home about, the rest of his arsenal is fun to employ. Also, he has eye lasers. Bzzz. Clonus is just an excuse to have you fight a stronger, tougher version of your selected character and pad out the campaign mode ladder in a creative way. But they have a bio, so let's talk about it. The one and only creation of Professor Raymond Deux, chief scientist and founding father of Edison Extractions, Clonus was intended to copy F.R.E.A.K.'s physical form and fighting style so well that they exceeded their opponent's capabilities. Edison Extractions is a fitting name for the creators of the copycat character, seeing as how Thomas Edison stole much of his inventions from Nikola Tesla. Finally, there's the boss of the game, Mutilator, a 40-foot dozer with a literal broken arsenal of one-hit moves and aggressively perfect AI that you have to fight on the 5th generation version of the Sons of Liberty Metal Gear Raid boss arena. 3 platforms in the middle of a piranha-infested ocean where the camera operator is about as helpful as a drunken Lakitu in Mario 64 when the dog snatches your controller and starts chewing on the C buttons, and your opponent is Big Zam.
Hey, Big Zam!
But I don't need to tell you how hard the boss is. Maximilian Dude can tell you, and he likely already has. What I'm here to tell you is that the person that pile of precision technology used to be was a woman bred for the sole purpose of being experimented on. As the pet champion of Microgene itself, she's been through more battles and had more body parts replaced than any other dozer before her, to the point that the mind control the inner circle of scientists and executives has over her is absolute and unshakable. Cave Johnson wishes he was as ruthlessly powerful as Microgene. Destroy her physical form. Free her from this mockery they call life. Become the champion you were destined to be. And then do a little dance. So, is F.R.E.A.K.S a hidden treasure we should be digging up? I certainly wouldn't mind seeing a modern version of it. Whether by actual writing skill or pure dumb luck, they created a pretty interesting world that I think would resonate with people in the modern era. And all the fighters look like secondary characters from Metalocalypse, so it's got that going for it. The biggest thing my thumbs were yearning for while playing this game was the kind of intuitive combat you'd find in something like Soul Calibur. Executing a strike while strafing, or pushing different directional buttons causing slightly different kinds of attacks that hit from different angles, instead of the vast array of special moves. Also, the flying is jank. Not quite Shadows of the Empire bad, but still not ideal, especially when you basically have to use it against Mutilator. It adds a level of complexity to a normal fight, and is certainly good for some laughs, but it hardly seems like it succeeded at being a true dynamic addition to the gameplay. One thing I will praise, however, is the fire button, which launches a projectile across the screen without the need for combination inputs, freeing those up for moves that are faster, deal more damage, have added effects, or differently shaped hitboxes. The fire button is a great accessibility option for every character to compete at range, and reminds me of a more sensible version of Marvel vs. Capcom 3's Simple Control mode or Injustice's character trait button. There's other stuff to praise, like the multi-leveled vertical arenas to encourage hovering, or the way some projectiles can stay stuck in your opponent, the ability to keep fighting after losing a limb, adding tension to a match, or the various visual effects that splatter across the screen. The N64 version even had an option to play in first-person mode, which was an absolutely fascinating inclusion, if clumsy to control. All in all, F.R.E.A.K.S was a pretty good, fun fighter that I wish felt a little better in my hands. I'd say it was just modern games spoiling me, but I recall feeling the same way when I played it back in the 90s. I just had to let that play. I would wander around my house as a kid singing that song on loop. Hell, sometimes I wander around my house today singing that song on loop, at least to myself. I'm EHRGEIZ, and welcome to Violent Profiles, where we discuss obscure fighting games and the rosters that define them. Clay Fighter was a brilliant idea by Visual Concepts that masked the typical gory violence of its contemporaries behind a veneer of colorful, moldable, unkillable clay. That alone was enough to pique my interest personally, as I was so fascinated by clay as a kid. I often daydreamed of the fun figurines and art projects I could make from it, especially those colorful multi-packs they'd sell at the school book fairs. So that's a big check on the list of child me's interests. They also had a carnival theme, another big check. Mutants, check. Absurdist humor, check. Unique animation style, checks all across the board. There were a couple of other clay-based games out at this time, one even by Interplay. Others simply used claymation in their advertising, but yet none of them appealed to me quite as much as Clay Fighter. I mean, look at this. Who could possibly get excited about playing this goalless fool? Later on, they even added some of my favorite cartoon voice actors in Clay Fighter 63 and a third, but that's another story for another day. Today, we're focusing on the first two entries in the series, Clay Fighter and C2 Judgment Clay. Both were Super Nintendo games, with the former receiving a Genesis port that was, for some reason, the version playable on the Wii Virtual Console. Maybe it had to do with the rebalancing that entry got. It certainly wasn't the graphics and sound. The simple backstory of Clay Fighter is that a purple clay meteor hit Mudville right in their local abandoned carnival of Playland, turning it into Clayland and forging from the wreckage fierce warriors who would each wish to become king of the circus. A prestigious title, to be sure.
Yeah.
What more story could you possibly need from a game where Elvis can fight evil Laffy Taffy? Since we're also covering C2 Judgment Clay today, let's take a look at how its story expands on the gripping background narrative of the first. The mysterious purple clay meteor that I guess has just been sitting in Mudville for the last 3 years increases its emissions, flooding the land in a sea of rising clay. This is thanks in part to the nefarious mad scientist Dr. Kiln, who hopped out of a spacecraft that looked exactly like a prune Danish and shot a snot rocket at the meteor. No, I am not kidding. Once again, fighters rise to battle for supremacy, including Tiny, the canon winner of the previous tournament. Enough epic backstory, let's start with the cover boy and arguably most famous character in the franchise, Bad Mr. Frosty. Gaining clay-powered sentience apparently did a number on this once mild-mannered snowman's empathy and compassion, because now his only desire is for the harsh chill of winter to permeate everything, launching the world into a permanent ice age. If you beat Clay Fighter with BMF... oh, I just got that.
You say this cat is a bad mother?
Shut your mouth.
I'm talking about
Bad Mr. Frosty!
Anyhow, if you win the original tournament with Frosty, he relocates Clayland to the North Pole and puts a certain overweight toy maker out of business, which is apparently somewhat canon even in the face of Tiny's victory, as his return in C2 says he just got off a maximum security iceberg for his assault on a Mr. S. Claus. Yet, in his ending in that game, it says that he becomes the head gift wrapper for the Mudville division of S. Claus and Company. Frosty has such a complicated relationship with this mysterious S. Claus character. I wonder if that ever gets resolved. Predictably, Frosty comes equipped with a vast array of snow and ice-themed moves, including a cold shoulder, which I feel has become an absolute staple of ice-themed fighters, and a Kano-style charging snowball attack. In C2, where Frosty trades his top hat for a 90s relevant backward cap, these moves are split between Bad Mr. Frosty and his even more evil counterpart, Ice. Much like the other clone fighters in this game, he doesn't have an explicit backstory, but when he wins, he gets an alternate ending where he bathes Mudville in Arctic wind and uses the locals as his personal skis. Why are these guys fighting? Why don't they team up? They seem like they'd get a lot more done if they worked together. One more note before we move on, the characters in the original Clay Fighter have little rapid-fire facts in their bios, likes, hates, etc. Most of it isn't very interesting. Frosty hates heat and loves snow. His motto is chill out. During development, he had the gimmick of being a huge fan of pizza, which I have to imagine was removed because it seemed less like a personality trait and more like a weak parallel to another popular group of mutants in the 90s. The detail I find most curious is his listed job as snowplow. Playland was abandoned before the meteor hit. Has he gone out and sought employment somewhere between being granted sentience by the alien meteor and the King of the Circus tournament? If he loves everything being blanketed in snow so much, why is he willing to be paid to clear it away from places? Is he gathering it up for his eventual super blizzard? Or is his desire to cover the world in snow and ice just an extended scheme in ensuring he'll never be out of work? You know what, I'm thinking way too hard about the details of Clay Fighter. Let's move on. Despite being the canon victor of the original tournament and thus the true king of the circus, Tiny was never a character who appealed to me. He was just a big, over-muscled dude in tiny pants and stupid boots who looked like Bald Bull had his head caved in with a crowbar. Changing his outfit colors in the first game only changed the color of his boots, and in the second game, while it changed the color of the tights as well, it also recolored his tongue.
No, sir, I don't like it.
His moves were also boring, with a charging left punch and a charging right punch. He had a Kano rolling ball move without the decency to have a top hat and carrot nose as part of it, and sort of a body splash anti-air, but his primary feature was how blisteringly hard he hit. He lost that in the second game, though his moves felt a bit more diverse in exchange. Tiny's story is just as simple. This Clayman loves wrestling, fighting, and his own muscles. He does not like thinking or people laughing at him. When he wins the original tournament, he turns Clayland into a wrestling gym and enforced a diet of broccoli and water on the citizens of Mudville. However, if victorious in the second tournament, he moves to the fast food world of Mud-Donald's, creating the new 100-pound buff burger that forces the eater to pump up their biceps while consuming it. I can't even be mad at this stupid ending. Look how happy he is to be selling his french fries. Tiny's evil C2 opposite number Butch is a dumber, oilier, and more flatulent counterpart. As much as I'm not huge on toilet humor in general, I appreciate a projectile being part of his offense, especially in C2 where Tiny himself just isn't as dominantly strong. If you win the game with Butch, he passes a law that prohibits anyone from being smarter than him, resulting in the exile of many varieties of farm-grown vegetables. I feel like this joke isn't quite fully fleshed out, but like all the other dupes, he has the same damn end slate as Tiny, and it has nothing to do with the text, so this is all the context we get. Another fun side note, Tiny's beta bio says he's married, which raises a host of questions, especially since he gets hitched to Helga in the version of events where she's victorious in the original Clay Fighter. They even have 8 hyperactive children who become the best wrestlers in the history of opera. You might be wondering what the hell that means. See, Helga is a plus-size Viking woman who sings opera, which is a clumsy combination of idioms and obscure 90s stereotypes. I don't know why Playland had a Viking-themed opera as opposed to like one of those Norse-inspired longboat carnival rides, but here we are. As puzzling a bio as many of her fellow fighters, Helga is from the far north, and her Viking heritage supposedly grants her special powers from Thor and Odin, which, as you could assume, include, hitting people with her butt. And singing really loudly. Just like Thor. Helga is decent enough in gameplay, the main drawback that, much like Tiny, you have to look at her while you play as her. This is nothing against her size, I just think her render looks miserable. Look at the shine on her chest armor. It keeps disappearing in the last frame of her idle animation. Abominable. Helga never returned to the Clay Fighter series after the first game, and I say good riddance to a bad joke. This is in contrast to another dated reference, obvious Elvis impersonator Blue Suede Goo, an aging circus freak granted delusions of grandeur and incredible powers by the meteor. In the original game, you fight him on this sweet piano level, the background for which is replaced in the tournament edition by a giant statue of what I can only assume is his O-face. Goo gives concerts from his porcelain throne, haha, that's how Elvis died, and apparently has a busy movie career despite, well, everything. Goo is one of those weird hand-me-down references like you'd see in Aladdin or Animaniacs. Kids back then would have no idea who Lawrence Welk was, for example, but the writers of the shows they watched did, and parodying him was a fun joke for the parents forced to watch alongside their Rugrats. In that way, my generation knows weird tidbits about the stars of yesteryear, hence an Elvis impersonator character in a game made 14 years after his death for an audience who wasn't around for the bulk of his career, if at all. And see, I wrote that, and I think it's good content, so I'm leaving it in, but the last year has proved me wrong about Elvis in rapid-fire succession. There was the highly successful Elvis movie, an Elvis impersonator bit on AEW, never mind my research bringing me to modern incarnations like Clownvis Presley, and the largest recorded gathering of impersonators happening in July of 2014 with 895 Elvi in attendance. So I stand corrected. Elvis lives on more than just a piece of toast. This incarnation of the enduring icon has some pretty decent attacks, using his hair as a weapon to cut his opponent in half, and launching music note projectiles that can inflict multiple hits. If he meets his destiny and becomes the king, he moves the carnival to Las Vegas and takes up residency, raising hound dogs and entertaining the crowd. That is, until he mysteriously vanishes and is never seen again, outside of the occasional sighting of him in grocery stores across the nation. As much of an obvious joke as that is, they never did bring Goo back to the Clay Fighter roster, and I think that's kind of a shame.
Elvis has left the building.
Speaking of Clownvis, being a game based in a circus, Clay Fighter also has a resident clown, Bonker.
Yeah, totally nuts.
No, not him, this guy. Snoozing under the big top when the meteor landed, Bonker became as hard as clay, which I don't believe is an improvement over, bones, and now uses his hilarious tricks to put the hurt on his opponents. So as you can expect, we get pies, squirting flowers, and cartwheels. Bonker also has mad hops, and being able to mix up the height of his projectiles can make him frustrating to predict. Beat the game with Bonker and he blows all the prize money, there's prize money, on cream pies and squirting flowers, then just hangs around the circus doing the same old, same old. I kind of admire that. The man clearly loves clowning, so why would he stop? You do you, you terrible clay clown. Another fighter who skipped C2, but we'll talk about again in a later episode, is Ichabod Clay. Probably my personal favorite among the bunch, the spooky specter who thinks the nighttime is the right time, was given substance by the clay meteor and uses his newfound body to torment the souls of Mudville. Other than his sweet Halloween aesthetics, the thing that made me a big fan of Ichabod was his solid moveset, with decent reach, a fireball, a shoryuken, and a teleport. Beat the game with him and you'll replace the staff of the circus with ghosts, which is a lot more tame than I would expect from an angry poltergeist given physical form, since what folks like Bad Mr. Frosty wish to accomplish is so much worse. Similarly, Taffy's only goal in Clay Fighter is to take control of the circus for his fellow candy beings, shut down the food stalls, and put on the best damn show a sapient glob of saltwater Taffy could manage. I really like Taffy because he has such a unique design you couldn't see outside of a game like Clay Fighter. He's got the reach you'd expect from a guy made out of stretchy candy, but his special moves are a little underwhelming in that they're just a number of dashes. He does have one interesting technique which allows him to fake being stunned in order to lure in your unwitting opponent. I'm not sure how useful this is in practice, but it's a neat idea. It's an utter shame Taffy wasn't brought back in C2, but someone who was that occupies an equally impressive creative space is series mainstay Blob. What some have called lazy character design in the past is one of the most simple yet ingenious concepts for this cart in particular. It's a game about clay. He's a living blob of amorphous clay who can turn into anything. And not in the lame shapeshifter way you might fear, where he doesn't have moves of his own and just copies everybody else's.
Your soul is mine.
He turns into a boot, or a bunch of boxing gloves, a chopping hand, stretches his eyes out to hit you, becomes a rocket ship or a buzzsaw. Lots of cool creative ideas that made Blob a blast to play. When Blob wins the tournament and becomes king of the circus, he discovers he isn't just radioactive goo, he's a life form from Clayterion, the origin of the meteor. He returns home and opens a circus there, bringing his knowledge of tent-based entertainment to amuse a brand new audience. In C2, he decides to terraform the Earth by sitting on it and making it really flat. That's stupid. His yellow-toothed evil twin Slick is even more underwhelming as he feels entitled to eat every building he can find, ending with a bad joke about finding an appropriately sized doggy bag for his leftovers. Dumb. So that's it for the original Clay Fighter crew, save for the final fight, N-Boss. He's a big string of clay pearls that throws every projectile in the game at you, and that's about it. Once he's defeated, you never see him again in the series. No intro, no outro, just fight these circles, I got nothing. The best one can manage is the pun of N-Boss sounding like End Boss and being similar to M. Bison, which is not good. Our standards were somewhat lower in the 90s. Before we move on fully to C2, I'd like to note that from Clay Fighter to the Tournament Edition, aside from some mechanical tweaks, the biggest thing they changed were the backgrounds, and almost all of them are startlingly worse than the originals. This is a baffling decision to me, as the style seems to carry over to Judgment Clay, with every arena being noisy and off-putting in the way the original stages largely weren't. Especially this back alley with a confusing perspective featuring a giant baby gang. Ugh. Each fighter also has fewer moves, even if a lot of the original Clay Fighter ones were redundant, and their normals are less fun to hit and less inspired than the previous entry. C2 is a hard downgrade, despite some of the exciting character ideas in it, and I'm very glad my mom never tried to track down this game and purchase it for me in my younger days, despite my frequent pleas. On the topic of giant babies, one of the newcomers to C2 is Goo Goo, a giant clay baby. Though I theorize that this isn't an actual baby and just an adult clay person with a diaper fetish, being as he's described as being good at pool, swearing up a storm, and flirting with every female he can find. Maybe it's a Baby Herman bit, I don't know. I hate it, whatever it is. This horrible baby throws bottles, crawls really fast, and hits you with his rattle, a giant spiked mace. If you beat the game with him, I like you less as a person, and he institutes government-endorsed nap time, which makes everyone in Mudville much happier, though the loud snoring becomes a problem. The other resident upsettingly adult baby/grown man in a diaper, Spike, ironically has a less rattle-focused moveset with a spinning dash, a flying butt bump, and a move where he screams at his opponent, which I think is supposed to work like Blanca's electricity, but only ever caused my opponent to heck all the way off. He also throws up a little bit as one of his regular attacks, and if you beat the game with him, he demands all the milk in Mudville, but doesn't drink it fast enough. So now he has 1,000 pounds of cottage cheese, and God, I want to throw up over this whole business. Let's move swiftly along to something far less disgusting, the surprisingly endearing Kangoo. Boxing kangaroos were kind of a thing back in the day, but Kangoo has the delightful distinction of being a reluctant fighter. She hates seeing the sight of spilled clay, tries to fix her opponents up after the match, and even closes her eyes during the onslaught. She wouldn't even be fighting, but those who have seen her throw down threatened to kick her ass if she didn't enter the tournament. Personally, my money's on her fans. As much as I like Kangoo's attitude, not her stage though, that looks like the Land of Confusion video on acid, her incredibly short range and underwhelming specials make her difficult to use, and her damage output isn't really compensated for because of it. It's just as well. If you beat the game with her, she donates the title belt, there was a title belt, and her opponent to the local museum. Her counterpart Thunder isn't much better, though she has a bit more reach with her normals. Win the tournament with this mysterious kangaroo, and she rules Mudville with an iron fist, forcing lawbreakers to live in her pouch for 3 months with a stale shellfish. You can see why that's stupid, right? Like, it's not even a joke. And also, what happens if more than one person breaks the law in the span of 3 months? Why am I still overthinking Clay Fighter lore? Nanaman is only a step higher in terms of reach and skill. His biggest asset is a slice of banana hurled as a projectile, which does a fair amount of damage, and having a dashing sweep as his crouching normal kicks. Unfortunately, he is a Jamaican banana who doesn't even have the good nature to look like a Jamaican banana. He's lazy, loves relaxing, and drinking mudaritas, so it's no surprise when he wins the tournament he turns the whole of Mudville into a tropical resort, and dresses like the lady who used to be on the Chiquita banana stickers. Dear God, this whole character was just a build-up to that joke, wasn't it? If you're expecting something better from Dr. Peelgood, you'll be delighted to know his banana slice throw briefly cuts the opponent in half, and dismayed to discover his victory results in him demanding all the banana peels in Mudville, so everyone is always slipping on stuff. Let's try to close this one on a pair of high notes, starting with Octohead, an octopus monster who spins around and is probably one of the more enjoyable melee-focused characters to play in C2. He's also one of the most visually appealing. While there's not much to his backstory of being a surfing party animal, his design makes up for it. If you win with Octohead, he turns Mudville into a 24/7 beach party scene. If you prefer the nefarious Jack, you'll enjoy a dashing bite attack that's pretty satisfying to land, and when he becomes the Grandmaster of Mudville, he decides he wants the ocean to himself and evicts all the other sea creatures. The town's denizens are left confused as to what to do with their sudden influx of homeless fish, which is probably the best joke in any of the C2 endings. Finally, we have Hoppy, the Arnold Schwarzenegger rabbit XP who likely inspired the game's name parodying Terminator 2. Or perhaps it was the other way around. You name your game C2 Judgment Clay, you need an Arnold among your roster. Thankfully, he lands as the most satisfying character to play, with a decent carrot projectile and the most useful Shoryuken. His backstory is an unplumbable joke that I don't get about how he talks to his muscles in order to get them to grow. His ending involves him making motorcycles the official vehicle of Mudville, and his art looks the least like a claymation figure of any member of the roster, but being fun to play is more important than any of that. I can't say the same for his more hyperactive twin Sarge. Lacking a projectile, even a more diverse set of punches and kicks can't save him from being violently underwhelming against block-happy opponents. Or even worse, those who can fling something from across the screen. Also a motorcycle enthusiast, in his ending, Sarge straps a jet engine onto his chopper and flies off the road, landing on the nose of a 747. And that's it. C2 doesn't have any unique bosses, just the evil twins who are unlockable via code inputs on the menu screen. There was a character who was sculpted but never implemented into the game, Lucy the ballerina gorilla. I like her design, and I'm curious to see how she would have turned out, but that's gonna have to remain a mystery for the ages. The Clay Fighter franchise has had a troubled life with a number of false start reboots, and while I'd love to live long enough to see one of them finally take shape, I won't be surprised if another sequel never does. Eventually we'll take a look at the 63 1/3 reboot and its infamous Sculptor's Cut, but until then I think I've had enough half-baked jokes to last me until at least 2024. Criticom is from a very specific era in gaming. Public internet was still young in 1995, so investigative journalism wasn't really a thing for video games yet. Never mind the lack of social media, meaning even when such information was found and reported on, it wasn't very widespread. You either had to be a part of an online community that discussed such things in a time where that wasn't really centralized, or pick up a gaming magazine and read reviews from people with names like Sushi X and ESAC. So, if a game was, say, incredibly bad, you might not know it before making a purchase. It was also still thoroughly in the Wild West of 3D gaming, and you saw a lot more titles willing to experiment on untested concepts. And sometimes those brave forays into the unknown were rife with bad decisions. We have this today with indie devs, but that was basically unheard of in the public consciousness before the rise of Steam. Sometimes taking a chance on a game, you got cult gems like Vib Ribbon, and sometimes you got well-intentioned flops like Quest 64, or... well... I'm Eric J. Chucky, and welcome to Violent Profiles, where we discuss obscure fighting games and the rosters that define them. It's easy to dismiss this game as bad. Terrible, even. And it is. Controls are sticky and awkward to the extent that landing an ordinary attack seems next to impossible. The computer is smart enough that the opponent is likely to block it, which does no chip damage, and respond with a perfect counterattack, if it's anywhere near connecting at all. Sometimes, for reasons I am not fully aware of, my character's life bar refills. When I jump, I careen into the sky, so aerial offense is a matter of luck more than timing. As this is a 3D game, you can strafe roll, but it moves you less than a single step forward or backward. Sometimes you don't move the direction you're facing, and your guess as to why is as good as mine. You might think it's the camera angle that's the culprit, but nope, sometimes it happens when the camera hasn't moved at all. This is more of a preference thing, but a lot of the special moves require you to hold down R1 or R2 and push a directional button, but not all. If you thought trying to remember which button is jump between 3 different first-person shooters was bad, try having your typical fighting game controls swapped for Smash Brothers, but backwards. How did this happen? Well, the short version is that everybody involved tried to rush it to completion by Christmas of '95 with less than 6 months of development time. And they did. It was even considered a commercial success and was ported to the Saturn over a year later, which much of this footage is from. Not that you can tell. This one's rough, guys. Try not to watch it on full screen. In fact, the smaller the screen, the better. Can you imagine this thing being released by a major publisher today? Gamers would explode. Review bomb the title on every website they could find, try to convince everyone in screaming distance that it sucks, and threaten death to the voice actors for some reason. But back then, we just kinda had to deal with it. Some of us even convinced ourselves that we liked it, and despite its obvious glaring flaws, it's actually not that hard to do. There are some very cool, ambitious ideas in here. You play the tournament ladder and face off against a souped-up version of yourself with more special attacks at the end, which you inherit upon defeating them before climbing the ladder again. At the end of your third attempt, you face the final boss of the game. That's one hell of a way to encourage replay and get you accustomed to the various special moves your character can perform. CRITICOM is also the first game in Violent Profiles that I've never played, and even though I have no nostalgia for it, I think it's important to look at games beyond my own personal history and catalog as many of the incredible character concepts out there as I can get my hands on. So, let's get to the plot. On the planet Hyperia dwell 2 clans, the Nizam and the Zerai. Both clans decide they're the chosen ones due to possessing an ancient relic that bestows great power, but not the wisdom to use it. A figure known as the Emperor leads them on a galactic conquest using whatever means necessary to install their rule in each system, including outright genocide. Eventually, they're victorious, and it looks like everything will be at peace, but just after the dying Emperor passes the relic on to his heirs, its protectors are killed and the relic is stolen. In truth, it's the Emperor who stole the relic after faking his death. That's the Thanos-looking fella right there. Not believing anyone to be worthy of its power. He had the relic, but decided to give the relic away to his heirs, but he didn't think they were worthy, so he faked his own death to steal the relic, which was his in the first place? Is the Emperor Vince McMahon? Regardless, each fighter is drawn into the challenge of recovering the relic, discovering the truth, and ultimately proving the Emperor wrong. Dayton Trent is our first playable character.
A ruthless mercenary who trusts no one and prefers to work alone.
This game was made in 1995, I don't know if I made that clear. The Chosen Ones hired Dayton to find the stolen relic, though after getting the intel, his plan is to sell it to the highest bidder and retire from the business, perhaps taking up fishing. Trent shoots lasers from his vacuum nozzle attachment, is pretty handy with his wiggly letter F, and is also proficient at spinning uppercuts. He dresses like a cross between Duke Nukem and Dash Rendar, and is probably one of the better characters for beginners who are committed to playing CRITICOM. Win the game with him, and Dayton throws the relic at some guy, the highest bidder I would assume, and then drives off into the desert on his tailpipe chimera. That's right, fully rendered, narrated intro cutscenes, and these are the kind of endings we're dealing with. Next is Delara of the Zerai clan, whose ideology rejects all technology, devoting themselves to the skill and honor of the true warrior, which I think means she only fights people 1v1 in the river next to Baron. While defending the relic from the thief, she was knocked out and her counterpart from the Nizam clan was killed. This dishonor caused her to pursue vengeance on the person who stole the relic, and with it, her destiny as one of its shepherds. Delara wields a sword and shield, dresses like a pirate from a screensaver in 1992, and her butt is always out. If you use her blade to best your opponents and supersede the Emperor, Delara puts the relic back on the pedestal. I feel like we backslid on ending quality into the 3D era. I wanted to give it the benefit of the doubt and speculate that it was just my preference for pixels showing, but if you look at the difference between a lot of late SNES game entries compared to early PlayStation ones, well, even Dancing Zangief is more of a satisfying conclusion than this. At least the intros are lively, and that's the thing that's going to sell you on playing more of the game and exploring its characters. In service to that, let's talk about Exene Dulate, a woman born on a planet in the state of constant war. Exene was basically raised by the military, but instead of it forging her into a killing machine, it made her sick at the waste of constant battle. She left her home planet in search of an answer, and hearing about the relic, was driven to find it in hopes of eradicating all war back home. She wields Twin Tonfa, has sort of a stun gun and a sick flip kick that can hit opponents behind her. She kinda reminds me of Demi Moore in that movie you can't talk about around Will Smith, with the most impressive set of polygonal pyramids this side of Lara Croft. Use Exene to claim the relic and you'll get to watch her in all her space-helmeted glory, heading back home for... Oh god, she's going back! She's going home! All this time it was... We finally really did it! Earth was the war planet! Damn you! Damn you all to hell! No, but for real, that's a decent twist and the most interesting ending we've gotten to enjoy thus far. Moving on, let's talk about Gorm, one of the last survivors of the peaceful people known as the Dorlons. They believe the relic is the birthstone of their race, and their king thinks Gorm is the prophesied champion who will rise to reclaim it. I don't know what a birthstone is to the Dorlons, but here on Earth it's just a pretty rock some jeweler's guild told me I should buy based on the month I was born. I hope it's more significant than that. This one-man right stuff walk seems really wasted on retrieving fodder for novelty pendants and earrings. If you're wondering what kind of epic resolution this Masters of the Universe reject in his spear can achieve, you will perhaps be unsurprised to find out that he brings the relic back to his home planet, hands it to the king, and his grateful people cheer. I think. I don't speak Dorlon. Dorlanese? Dorlanish? Next up is Sid, the sentient integrated droid, a killing machine and the result of an experiment gone haywire. They've been traveling the galaxy destroying all carbon-based life forms, most recently the Wampas of Hoth, which brings them to the current stage of battle. While the other characters are questing for the relic, Sid wants only to kill. Sid has missiles and some decent range to their attacks, which meant I was doing pretty well just button mashing until I pressed left on my controller, and Sid ran to the right of the screen and straight off the edge. Probably my favorite character in the game, 10 out of 10. After Sid myrtleizes the Emperor for being based on carbon, they recover the relic on a storm planet where giant faces glare at you from all angles, and then eat it over their shoulder and wander off. Sid is my hero. Part of the reason I didn't experience a lot of these early PlayStation entries is because my mom picked up a copy of Electronic Gaming Monthly and was duped by their April Fool's joke about a nude code in Tomb Raider, so it wasn't until my 14th birthday in 1999 that she felt I was mature enough to enjoy the console responsibly. I don't remember what eventually convinced her, and I sure as hell didn't find out about the code being a hoax until I was well into adulthood, but if she had seen Demonica, it would have set the clock back another 5 years. This hooved woman in 1995's hottest Frank Frazetta swimwear shoots fireballs and is described by the game itself as being mysterious. Our narrator also lets us know that nobody is sure why she's here. Thankfully, the manual offers us more insight and suggests that there is an ancient stone similar to the relic in her own dimension, and obtaining both will grant her untold power over evil and darkness, which is probably bad. Claw your way to the top with Demonica, and the camera goes Michael Bay around her before she turns into... this thing. So that can't be good. Sonork Nazam is what you might expect of an alien, the little gray man or Duros model wearing Cable's costume o' many pockets. His brother was one of the guardians of the relic and was supposed to become the next emperor, but Sonork I guess was there and sneaked in to murk his brother and jump the line. This is while the emperor was enacting his fake my own death to steal the relic back plan, like literally these things happened in the same room at the same time. Sonork primarily attacks with wiggly fingers and roundhouse kicks, and you laugh, but those wiggly fingers are fast, and that counts for a lot in this stupid, unresponsive cinderblock of a game. I'm told he gets plasma sickles later, but if you thought I was dedicated enough to play this game to the point that I messed with these characters in their higher level forms, you have not been paying attention to this video. Beat the game with him and we're treated to something Criticom's legal team can prove is definitely not the opening to A New Hope. This is followed by some footage of a space war. I'm not sure that Sonork is in charge of the ship there, but I have to imagine he's up the chain of command somewhere. Otherwise, this would just be a pointless, disconnected ending, and they wouldn't do that, would they?
They would.
Finally, we have Yenji, a space cyborg ninja whose people were killed during all the wars the Chosen Ones did to make the peace that lasted for about 20 minutes. She's dedicated her life to training her body and mind to seek vengeance, finally taking her moment to destroy the relic after it was stolen and is now, presumably, easier to get to. I don't know, it doesn't sound like great logic to me personally, but I'm not Yenji. She fights about how you'd expect a ninja to fight if you trap them in infinite pudding, with cool claw weapons and a lot of agile kicks. Yenji was the first character I realized I could use passwords to call up their level 3 forms on, and I decided to give it a try to see if the unlocked powers made the game any better. They did not, so I didn't bother trying anyone else. You might think that's not very thorough of me, and you would be fully correct. In Yenji's ending, a DeviantArt OC hybrid of Doomguy and Wolverine drops the relic into a bubbling sea of ecto-cooler. I know this is just level 3 Yenji, but this game is so empty sometimes I don't even have much to mock, so I mash two popular characters together and you chuckle and hit the like button. It's kind of our thing. It's a shame the interesting ideas attempted in CRITICOM ended up in CRITICOM. Characters evolving as they fought, the sci-fi setting as opposed to the more typical modern-day martial arts tournament, and even the specific characters and plotlines they chose to explore could have all been really fun in a better format. A CRITICOM movie or miniseries with Dayton and Exene at the center might have been fun to watch, especially if it was made with the same Dune-like bent toward enigmatic presentation we see in cutscenes here. It's so easy to criticize.
Fun too.
But I prefer to try to find the beauty in a flawed thing. I fully believe CRITICOM would have been a better game with more development time, which is true of basically every video game. And I can see the shimmering diamonds hiding deep, deep in the rough of what we've got. That said, there is hope. I say hope in quotation marks because I know better, but there were two more fighting games by Kronos Digital Entertainment, Dark Rift and Cardinal Sin. We'll be exploring both eventually, and who knows? Maybe they'll succeed at keeping the promise of what CRITICOM attempted. There's not a lot of obscurity in modern fighting games, between the internet being such a great platform for people to share niche interests and most entries in the genre being from enduring franchises. There isn't much demand for me to talk about Geese, Howard, and Soul Bad Guy after all. Unless there is? I assume most folks watching these videos know more than enough about the most popular fighting games characters, but let me know in the comments if I'm wrong. Either way, it can be difficult to find a fighter from the last 10 years to talk about in depth on this show. Well, one I'm willing to cover, anyway. I almost made this episode about Vanguard Princess, which sounds like a completely innocent game, but it made me uncomfortable. Thankfully, this gave me the opportunity to try out another fighting game that's been gathering dust in my library for some time. I'm EHRGEIZ, and welcome to Violent Profiles, where we discuss obscure fighting games and the rosters that define them. Today we're talking about 2016 PC fighter Verdict Guilty by UK-based studio Retro Army Limited. Unlike a lot of hidden gems we cover on this show that require you to have a functioning retro console or engage in a little of the old yar-har fiddle-dee-dee, you can just buy this game on Steam for $5. It's obviously inspired by Street Fighter II, but unlike many clones that came out back in the 90s, this game has the advantage of seeing what did and didn't work in every game before it. The controls felt a little loose at first, but the longer I played, the more comfortable I was dropping cross-ups and executing combos with fluidity. I love the retro aesthetic, right down to a limited palette mostly focused on shades between blue and red, with the occasional orange or green highlight. You can unlock different modes, each character has their own role in the interconnected story with dialogue and cutscenes, and it's just fun to play. For the price, it's a steal. The whole thing was inspired by Guile's glitch throw handcuffing the opponent in the arcade version of Street Fighter II, so if you're playing a good guy in police-themed Verdict Guilty, the goal is to literally handcuff your opponent and defeat them while they're detained. If you're a bad guy, you get a special effect as part of your attack, like a disorienting strike or a timed explosion dealing massive damage. Before we get into it, I feel the need to point out that I am not Korean, nor do I speak the language. I've done my best to track down proper pronunciations of these names, but the internet and I are both fallible, so if you know better, I'd be happy to receive constructive criticism in the comments. The long and short of the plot is that unplayable politician/crime boss Sang is looking to take over the South Korean setting of Neo Seoul with his briefcase flamethrower/machine gun and a lot of hired muscle. His plan is complicated and multifaceted, including faking a UFO crash, or did he, and hiring a cult of mad bombers to cause havoc in the streets. As a final boss, he's pretty enjoyable, especially since money falls out of him sometimes when he takes damage.
My fight money!
Hilarious. As for the playable characters, let's start with the babyface Shiwoo, a relatively young officer who wants to do his father Dae-soo proud. Each character has an unlockable alternate outfit of another person who has a role in the collective tale, but only one of them has a proper story to follow. In this case, Shiwoo goes on a mission to uncover corruption in Neo Soul's police department, while Dae-soo offers initial training and acts as a minor fight in many of the other characters' stories. Shiwoo is a little simple-minded for my tastes, but his father has entrusted him with the ancient art of pigeon fu. If Shiwoo manages to defeat the nefarious Sang, peace and order are restored to the Force, and he meets his father for their weekly Friday morning training. On the side of the criminal element, Jay is a chain-smoking, break-dancing Yakuza with an Uzi. Most characters in the game have an ability that draws in their ammunition as seen below their character portrait. Fire so many times and you have to reload, which I really like as a way to keep the Hadouken spam to a minimum. Looking at you, Deadshot. What's more is many of the ammo attacks are slightly different to give each character their own unique feel. Anyhow, Jay is charged with kidnapping a child to force one of the members of the police force to do Sang's bidding. The kid inspires him to question his life choices, and when he finds out his brother Sapporo killed their father to become boss of their gang, he's filled with burning determination to make things right. Defeating Sang and Sapporo sees Jay assume leadership and commit to turning the gang around to support the city and do good. Like Ryuji in Saint Young Men.
Yes!
Back on the side of the law, or at least something that resembles it, we have Reese, a black-suited foreigner who would probably like you to think he works for a major government organization. In reality, he seems to be one of many UFO-chasing nutjobs in town to investigate the crashed Sang fake. He spends most of his journey chasing his friend Bob, who had a full-on alien freakout and ran off through the city yelling about voices in his head and the little one. Thing is, I'm not sure these characters are agents of any government or even human at all. They have blue blood, extendo arms, and do this instead of reloading. Like, I get the Dulcim reference, obviously, but I'd really like to know more about what the hell is going on with these Men in Black wannabes within the universe of Verdict Guilty.
That's why they put the I in FBI.
Johan is a member of a terrorist cult specializing in bombs, acid, and hallucinogens. While his specials are pretty strong, his normals are the second most frustrating in the game to use. He's a student of Sung Ki, who had set up a cult of fellow mad bombers with the goal of waking up the city. This is, of course, a ruse to do wicked deeds for Sang, which Johan eventually discovers. After confronting his master and the man behind it all, he decides to go home and think about his life choices. It's interesting how there are 4 criminal characters, and yet none of them are very committed to crime in their story mode endings. Sure, some of them were set up or victims of circumstance, but then there's Johan, who joined a cult about blowing shit up because he really likes blowing shit up. Or he wanted to feel like he belonged, I guess. I don't know, man. You want to feel like you're a part of something, you join a book club or start doing drugs, not explode your hometown. I feel like Johan's ending should have him running the cult now, and they dedicate themselves to mass destruction for mass destruction's sake. Or at least engage in some jazzy rambling like the evil midnight bomber what bombs at midnight.
He says to me, "You got style, baby. But if you're gonna be a real villain, you gotta get a gimmick." And so I says, "Yeah, baby, a gimmick, that's it. High explosives."
The only female character in the game is Minso, while her counterpart Mia. They're both traffic cops in Neo Soul, with Minso charging through the city looking for her dog and accidentally uncovering Sang's plot, and Mia being a pawn in the game whose child Jay kidnapped as a bargaining chip. She attacks with her ammo-using stun gun and the aforementioned doggo Charlie. She's also the owner of a move gratuitously dubbed Panty Shot. I'll let you work out on your own which one that is. It's less than inspiring for 3 of the 4 heroic characters to be kind of idiots who accidentally slapstick their way through the plot, but I think the heel characters make up for it. Take Gun, for example. He was set up by someone for the murder of the chief of police, which was basically the tipping point for this whole situation. He and his pals bust out of prison and he goes on a rampage through the city to find the guy who sold him out and make him pay. Of course, this leads him to Sang, but the real culprit who committed the crime was his best friend and cellmate, Konu. Gun is happy to go back to jail because it means he'll be able to punish Sang and Konu and perhaps help them mend their wicked ways. His name is rather ironic, of course. Gun has a complete lack of projectile attacks, including any moves that use ammo. It'd be like naming the boxer in Street Fighter Kick, which is another thing Gun cannot do. In exchange for this, he hits like an absolute beast, and his rolling attack is one of the most easily abused in the game. Still, after having used so many other characters, his lack of a real cross-up option made me spend more time on completing his story than anyone else, getting me especially stuck on the fight against Konu. The most compelling hero was the first one I played, and a decent introduction to the game's mechanics, Kyung. A disgraced alcoholic detective, he's been a wreck since the love of his life, Chio, was murdered. Despite the insistence of Toyun, his friend on the force, he goes out in search of her killer, who is eventually revealed to be Johan. Again, A guy who probably shouldn't have had the go home and rethink my life ending. Much like in The Crow, Kyung wants to take out the man who ordered the hit, and that means Sang. He offers Sang redemption, but the bastard refuses and says he's too old, but there may yet be hope for Kyung. Flowers in hand, he visits Chia's grave and ponders the future. Kyung's tale is treated with more respect than a lot of the others, and I could absolutely see him as the protagonist of a badass late 80s crime thriller. I would in fact love to see that. Before we get to my absolute favorite character, I'd like to talk about Sabu. No, not him. Why do you always think it's someone not from the game? Who's editing these videos anyhow?
Am I a stinker?
Sabu in this context is the goofy police quartermaster and dummy for the training mode who is Sang's inside man. He has a dog of his own and a freaking shotgun, so he makes a pretty formidable opponent, especially during some of the challenge rounds where you're meant to avoid the character or defeat them under certain restrictions like low health or a time limit. He wears a lot of hats in the story of Verdict Guilty, from mentor to arms dealer to betrayer. The most positive role he plays is in Hyuk's story. Our final villain, we catch up with Hyuk in the middle of a bank robbery where his partner Ye-jun takes the money and runs. Hyuk loads up and chases him down, making a few friends and enemies along the way until finally confronting Sang and getting back what he rightfully stole. Money in hand, he returns to Sabu and pays his debts for all the guns he's bought on credit over the years, then visits his mother in hospital to pay for her expensive medical treatments. It might land in a cheesy way, but I appreciate the message the story delivers. You never know what drives someone to do bad things, and it's not always evil in their hearts that takes them to these extremes. The best part about Hyuk, however, is his moveset. There's a lot to love between his firearm being an assault rifle that uses all its ammo at once, his dash where he hits his opponent with the butt of his gun, and his incredible rolling grenade trap. But the real money is in his normals. Hyuk's diving kick can be spammed several times in one jump to whittle down an enemy's health, and unlike Johan, he can easily bounce an opponent back into his grenade after planting it. Plus, I don't know, look at him. He's the second most stereotypical robber in fiction next to the goon in the striped pajamas and black eye mask. Inspired. Verdict Guilty was a fun little fighting game I packed almost 5 hours into the first time I sat down to play it, and I could see myself picking it up again to check out what else could be unlocked, or to try my hand at some of its other modes. I can only imagine how fun it is to play against a friend, and I encourage you to pick it up for yourself.
Beyond the edge of reality lies a story of ultimate conquest, a story of war and friendship, a story of a love that can never be, and a hatred that always was. And now, the most anticipated epic adventure of the year will never come to a theater near you.
Final Fantasy VII hit different, man. Personally, I prefer 6, but to say 7 didn't have an undeniable impact on the world of gaming would be a foolish falsehood. It put JRPGs on the map in the West, Square back in the saddle of gaming, and hands-on controllers obsessively collecting and maxing out every single materia. This game had an unprecedented demand for spin-offs and sequels in the Final Fantasy series, though we wouldn't see any until before Crisis in 2004. We did see Cloud and friends as special guests in games like Chocobo Racing, Final Fantasy Tactics, and of course today's topic, I'm Eric J. Chucky, and welcome to Violent Profiles, where we discuss obscure fighting games and the rosters that define them. Now, while Cloud, Tifa, Sephiroth, Vincent, Yuffie, and Zack are the reasons a lot of us were drawn to this game, they were not the primary characters, and we actually won't be covering them in detail for today's episode. Kinda like I said last week about King of Fighters and Guilty Gear, these characters are popular enough that you probably don't need me to tell you about them. Unless you'd like me to. Let me know in the comments, and we'll see what happens when I run low on fighting games. EHRGEIZ was made by Dream Factory and published by Namco for the arcade in 1998, then ported to the PlayStation by Square later that year, which is the version we're mostly going to be talking about today. In addition to the expected tournament ladder and versus modes, the home port of EHRGEIZ sported a dungeon-crawling RPG-esque quest mode, and a number of minigames. My favorite was Battle Beach, although at this point in my life I'm not 100% sure why.
It's sexual, baby.
EHRGEIZ also integrated wrestling into the mix, quite unlike most other 3D fighters of the era, drawing from Dream Factory's own Tobal series, which we'll probably get into in a later episode. Picking the game up again, memories of trying to find victory within the awkward yet robust combat system came flooding back to me. It's very reminiscent of Tekken in that attacks feel deliberate and are a little slower than other fighters, and you have a lot of freedom to move around the environment with its multiple tiers and interactable objects. It reminds me a bit of the first Dark Souls in its mechanical execution, and ironically a lock-on option would have helped the fighting in this fighting game feel more intentional and less the result of dumb luck. Anyhow, onto the plot. The EHRGEIZ sword is an incredibly powerful weapon sealed away by the EHRGEIZ stone. The item on offer is the prize for winning the EHRGEIZ tournament, which was founded by the recently deceased Carl Schneider. The enigmatic sounding German word that I spent most of my life pronouncing EHRGEIZ translates to ambition, which I think you'll agree is a strange name for a sword. I tend to save my preferred characters for near the end of these lists, so let's start with one instead. Han Daehan is a master of Taekwondo and an action movie star who famously does his own stunts. 1 year before the tournament, Daehan was filming in the Middle East when a mysterious black smoke enveloped his leg and snooched it out from under him, leaving him with a particularly acute case of phantom limb syndrome.
Oh, aren't you cute?
His curiosity grows when he finds out a similar incident occurs every few decades near the ancient ruins where the titular sword is housed. In the 90s, there was a lot of talk about the slim chances of one-legged men in ass-kicking contests, which Han Daehan avoids by having a secret artificial leg full of serious hardware, making him play something like Warong from Tekken if Warong had knees full of rocket-propelled grenades. So, anytime you beat the game, you're treated to a final fight against Red Scorpion here, and you're supposed to break open both the weird clear boxes and kill him with the sword inside so that the real EHRGEIZ drops from the sky. But only Daehan has a penalty for failing to do so, as evidenced by his bad ending, where he looks forlornly out the window and still has a mechanical leg. Try again, the game encourages, so let's say you do when you succeed at capturing the sword and defeating Red Scorpion. Instead, while Han is still sitting at the same window, lit by the same police lights, he now has his real leg back and stands up to exit his apartment with determination. See, much like Final Fantasy VII and, well, I guess CRITICOM, EHRGEIZ goes for the less is more approach to storytelling, the FMVs are cool approach. Instead of some sort of satisfying text or dialogue concluding the fighter's tale, you get disconnected, 25-second long cutscenes that convey something. What took Daehan's leg? Who were the other victims? How are they connected? Will it happen again? Nah, none of that. Real leg's good, rocket leg's bad. Fine, gotcha. If you're looking at pro wrestler character Dasher Inoba and thinking, man, this guy sure looks like Antonio Inoki with a bowl cut, that's because he basically is. The former disciple of tournament promoter Carl Schneider is primarily motivated by discovering the reasons behind his master's death, as well as solving the mystery of the sword and the stone. So, naturally, if you beat the game with him, he eats a shit ton of ramen. He really goes for it, too. Look at him. Slurping it up. Can you imagine a modern game doing this? Even a From Software game with their esoteric, muddled finales would be blasted to hell for just showing you a main character monging down on some noodles into infinity. You know, then again, I could see it. Let's move on. Yoko Kishibojin, better known as Yo-Yo for her signature weapon, is a TH agent of Interpol as part of their hand-to-hand combat research team. That sounds real. The reason given for this is that after her parents' divorce, she was raised primarily by her mother, who is an expert in their family's personal brand of jiu-jitsu. Given that her father is a prominent archaeologist, Yoko was tasked by Interpol to investigate all the recent suspicious nouns involving the word EHRGEIZ. In her ending, she does in fact wield the blade itself and seems to be trying to escape Dasher Inoba, which she does by exploiting his hubris before treating us to a solid attempt at rendering and animating a tongue in 1997. Yoko's father and the protagonist of the quest mode is this Chris Redfield-looking fella Koji Masuda, and it's a good thing he wasn't the martial artist of the family because instead of Kishibojin Ryu Jiu-Jitsu, Yoko would have had to practice the Masuda method. Tip your waitresses. My experience with EHRGEIZ came at home, borrowing the game from a friend or playing it with them on PlayStation when they'd stay over for the weekend. One friend in particular became a master of using Masuda's special attack, which spams a series of wrestling submissions to wreck the opponent with little or no opportunity for a response. We are no longer friends. Koji doesn't seem to have a proper ending in arcade mode other than holding the EHRGEIZ aloft while the text on screen talks about sweet materia and the sword. In the quest mode, I'm gonna be honest with you guys, I've never beaten the Forsaken Dungeon and have no plans to do so. It is difficult, complicated, and beyond my patience as a teenager with nothing else better to do. It's well beyond my ken now. So I have no idea what's going on here. I gather you get a Phoenix down somehow, and you can either use it to save the other character in the dungeon or not. If you do, sweet, she comes back to life, and the only remaining link to immortality through the dimensions is taken away, marking the end of the challenge against the Guardians and seals away its mystery and ambition into the eternity of time. If you can parse any of that, let me know in the comments. If you don't use the Phoenix down on her, Koji brings it back for his colleagues to research, but hell, the entrance to the dimensional junction could not be found, causing everyone to shun the guy who found the secret to immortality and have his research lost to history. Sure. His counterpart in the Forsaken Dungeon is Claire Andrews, appropriately resembling a Jill Valentine you bought off Wish. This 16-year-old prodigy practices Jeet Kune Do with aplomb and raids temples about as well as her teacher Koji, but she's considered impulsive and naive, having forced her way along for the ride into quest mode. Similarly, she has no arcade ending, and you have a choice in the dungeon to give the Phoenix down to a wounded Koji, or not do that thing. Bring him back and you get the same ending as Koji, but with the nouns swapped. But if you choose the latter, Claire stuffs the feather in a vase and moves on with her life, presumably leaving her teacher and mentor's corpse buried deep beneath the temple. Zero guilt on this girl, ice in her veins. Let's talk about Prince Doza, known as Prince Nassim in the Japanese version of the game. This was changed for international releases because it's the name of an actual British boxer who was popular at the time, and there were copyright concerns. Which is a fine mistake to make, nothing like that has ever happened in a fighting game before. Doza is a kickboxer, but I can see why they'd want to put distance between the two, especially since it's implied he may have indeed been inspired by the real-life Nassim Hamed. Doza is one of those pure athletes who has reached the apex of the kickboxing world and enters the tournament looking for a greater challenge. There's dudes with explosives in this game though, so he gets a special glove that can shoot fireballs. Where did he get these gloves? Can you just buy them at the corner store? I want these gloves. Victory against Red Scorpion earns you a cutscene where Doza is handily defeated by his own training bag. Truly the world's greatest athlete. Another martial artist in the game inspired by a real-life figure is Li Shu Wen, named for one of the most skilled practitioners of Baji Quan. The EHRGEIZ version instead practices Kenpo, but much like his namesake, he professes to have mastered the technique of killing a man with a single strike. Unlike the real guy, Li used an elixir he found in the tomb of the first emperor to return to life, albeit Benjamin buttoning slowly into a baby, so he's hoping competing in the tournament will help him find the true key to immortality. Bring him the victory he so seeks and you'll be rewarded with a cutscene of him, younger, and extinguishing a row of candle flames with a single key strike, which is a nice change of pace in that it makes sense. Li's one of the characters from this game that is actually pretty cool, having a Shang Tsung/Rasputin vibe. A lot of stories could have been told with him, especially if EHRGEIZ had persisted as a franchise into more developed eras of fighting. Similarly cool is Django, the wolf-like secondary boss of the game. And also the final boss, I guess, since Red Scorpion uses his chassis. I like the option for a playable four-legged creature in a fighting game, and I'm often drawn to odd silhouettes like the monstrous ogre from Tekken or Shumagorath in Marvel vs. Capcom. I like seeing how developers choose to correspond different attacks and movement to unique shapes. Anyhow, I know what you might be thinking, but Django is not Red 13 from Final Fantasy VII. He may look a lot like Red 13, have an alternate color palette similar to Red 13, have many moves named for Red 13 and things related to him, but he is absolutely an original character for the game EHRGEIZ, not Red 13. Got it? Okay, good. He doesn't have an ending, I guess because he's technically Red Scorpion. It's more like he wins? He still has the EHRGEIZ? Status quo maintained? Who knows? Speaking of wolves, let's talk about Wolf Girl Joe. Have you ever been playing a video game before and found it lacking in some way? Mashing your fingers against the buttons, realizing this would be so much more fun if Blanca from Street Fighter was here. This thought apparently occurred to Dream Factory as baby Joe survived a plane crash in the Amazon only to be raised by the local wildlife and imparted knowledge of capoeira. I am not kidding. Only instead of being green and monstrous like Blanca, Joe looks like a southern gal just off the ranch. Don't let her comely blonde locks fool you though. Joe was apparently notorious for cannibalistic attacks on the Brazilian locals before being captured and imprisoned by Red Scorpion, who gave her the name Joe and told her to go after the EHRGEIZ for reasons that are not elaborated upon by anyone involved. In Joe's ending, she's fighting a bunch of guys in the back of a train hauling lumber until our old buddy Dasher Inoba cuts the logs loose from their vehicle. Joe expertly hops up these falling logs as the mooks she was battling tumble to their doom, only to miss the last jump by a few feet and smack cartoonishly into the wall. Guys, I'm starting to think these endings might not be very good. Let's bounce to Sasuke now, a mysterious agent of Red Scorpion whose true identity is unknown, owing in part to his mild case of amnesia. During a mission to assassinate Koji Masuda, his hand is stayed when he notices a broken sword bearing a strange stone, which he believes will return his memory. It's a good thing he's skilled at acrobatics, because it would take a ninja master to jump to that conclusion. Also, I'm not sure why he didn't just kill Masuda and take the stone in the first place, but whatever. He's here now. Complete your mission and we're treated to a very dramatic view of Sasuke's house with multiple camera angles before watching him bless his sword and ninja vanish through a spinning door. Finally, we've reached the character with my favorite ending in the game, God Hand. Not to be confused with the 2006 Capcom and Clover Studio game of the same name, Ken Godhand Mishima is a demolitions expert and former mercenary of Red Scorpion who pieced out with exclusive knowledge of the ancient ruin housing the EHRGEIZ. He did this by cutting off his literal right hand, which I guess is a requirement, and then sold the info to a wealthy syndicate whom we can presume was once headed by Carl Schneider. Equipped with a new cybernetic right hand, the titular God Hand, Ken believes the stone and the sword to be his destiny, so he has entered the tournament to claim them. Beat the game with this man, and you are treated to footage of him blowing up a car and walking away from it like a badass, which, like most of the endings, is largely viewable in the opening cutscene. And then my favorite part. The screen goes black and white, and letters begin appearing, spelling the phrase, "Touched by the hand of God." Hand. Touched by the hand of God Hand. That's terrible. That does not sound cool. It has never sounded cool. This phrase has lived rent-free in my head since 1998, and it will continue to do so until the day my memory fails me and I develop a craving for prunes. But because everything put on the internet stays there forever, I'll just watch this video again and laugh my ass off anew. Touched by the hand of God. It was so easy to fix. Touched by the hand of God, God Hand. You snap to a second screen with his name on it. That sounds cool. Criminy. You might be wondering what kind of ending Cloud, Sephiroth, and the rest of the gang have, or if they have one at all, and they do, but it's basically just clip show trailers for Final Fantasy VII. That might have been exciting before the game came out, but here it just comes off as lazy. We've already seen all this. When I was a kid, EHRGEIZ commanded my attention with characters from a game I love, and some unique twists on combat, but those things don't hold up as well in a world with Smash Bros. Ultimate and Dissidia. The controls were a little funky back then, and feel a lot more funky now. The lack of character development and proper endings are big blows to my overall experience, even if watching Sephiroth prance around shirtless on a beach is still just as satisfying as it was 20-some-odd years ago. Lewis Black did this bit about candy corn that I feel very connected to every time I try WEAPONLORD again. I find myself looking at fighting games, and there it is, as though I've never seen it before. A pre-Soul Calibur 16-bit Namco weapon battler, with designs by Simon Bisley, the Lobo guy? I can't wait! Then I pick it up and push buttons while those sprites move in slow motion with a very noob-unfriendly core combat system, and I am once again left disappointed. And ironically, I like candy corn. Electronic Gaming Monthly had the whole of it with the most apt criticism I can level at it being the concepts are there, but the game isn't. And isn't that how a lot of these old fighters go? While not as god-awful as something like CRITICOM, it still has a lot more going for it in ideas and visual design than it does in gameplay. So, it's a good thing the former is what we do here. I'm Eric J. Chucky, and welcome to Violent Profiles, where we discuss obscure fighting games and the rosters that define them. Developed by Visual Concepts for release in 1995, on top of WEAPONLORD's inherent issues, the game starts you out on its second highest difficulty, and the default button mapping is all over the place, including having one of the heavy attacks mapped to a face button instead of a bumper. Did I switch my heavy attacks to the rightmost face buttons in Street Fighter II Turbo as a kid? Yes, absolutely. But I mapped both of them with some semblance of logic, and Street Fighter heavy attacks move like this, whereas WEAPONLORD's move like this. One could charitably compare the deliberate pace of the attacks to Tekken, but WEAPONLORD lacks Tekken's fluidity, especially on the heavies, which makes them a bit too awkward to use reliably. Project lead James Goddard claimed it was the end of the fourth console generation that hurt this game's success and stopped it from getting a sequel, but let's be real here, the game just isn't that good. Say it with me now. And that's a shame, because there's some really cool stuff here. It's possible to break your opponent's weapon, for example. Whether or not you kill your opponents has an impact on story mode, forcing you to fight them again in a final gauntlet if they yet live, and altering the ending depending on who you kill. There's also a metric buttload of narrative to this game for being on the SNES. If you beat the arcade mode with a character, you get extra insight into their path. There's barbarian flavor baked into every nook and cranny of this experience, like being able to disrespect your opponent by cutting their hair or breaking their helmet mid-fight, and all the post-match quotes being about barbarian honor and killing being the barbarian way. The game even opens with the thrilling sentence, "Since the dawn of time, man has battled." That's some A+ 1995 shit right there. So there's a guy called the Demon Lord Wraith who possessed the body of a warrior named Zarak and rose to power, slaying kings and uniting tribes under his evil banner, only to have a prophecy fall on his shoulders. When the moon is bleeding, ripped by the skeletal fingers of death, a child shall be born under the warrior's moon who will rise to fell the Demon Lord in combat. A little later, Zarek's advisor is like, "Yo, my lord, it's that blood moon. You should probably kill every child born under this moon." And Zarek is like, "Nah, I got a better idea. Let's wait until they grow up and have a tournament, and I'll fight the winner." Hey, that's a good enough story for me. When your logo looks like this, I really don't need much more incentive to step into the fray, so let's get into it. Going from left to right on the character select screen, Kor is the future leader of the F.R.E.A.K. clan, but his heart is disquieted and he leaves to find himself. See, Kor is still haunted by visions of his brother King, who was taken in a raid 7 years ago. The two brothers had reached the age of 13 and were getting their facial tattoos that marked them as being able to take the lives of their enemies. Kor gets his, but King is just sitting down to get tatted up when marauders strike. He gets taken, Kor fights his way to find him, but all he can track down is a campsite full of dead marauders. Problem is, according to the rules of the F.R.E.A.K. clan, if King killed his captors without being marked by the tattoos, he's betrayed the ancient rites and is marked for death. Kor gets drawn north by word of the tournament and fights his way to the finals, and he's really feeling himself. And why shouldn't he be? Out of all of them, Kor's moveset seems the most inspired by Arnold Schwarzenegger's Conan with a huge twirling broadsword. His special moves integrate a lot of fire into those attacks, if you can be bothered to execute them. Zarak sees this and offers Kor a position at his side, but Kor tells him to kick rocks and the two scuffle before they're pulled apart by officials. Which is interesting to me. You'd think the officials of the Demon Lord's tournament would just let him, kill a guy. But maybe they think Kor's badass enough to do the job and don't want to see their boss get murked before some other, less skilled fighter gets a lucky death blow in on Kor. If you're good enough at the game, however, the tournament officials were right to be worried. Kor slays the Demon Lord and in doing so discovers the true identity of fellow fighter Bane was King the whole time. Kor is overcome with grief and insists his brother should not have been marked for death, that he should have been allowed to kill in self-defense. Sacred tattoos be damned. Kor laments that his brother did not reveal his true nature to him and is haunted by visions of his decapitated face for the rest of his days. I love it when you put extra effort into beating a game and it makes the ending shittier. Kor is one of only 2 fighters in the game with a special ending, the other being Zarak, who you can't even use in story mode without cobbling together a special password. If you beat the game as Kor without killing Bane, he just wins and goes back to wondering where his brother is. Talazia's memories are a mystery prior to the moment she fell out of the sky 7 years ago. She was adopted by an animal spirit worshipping tribe and taught to walk and talk, despite by all appearances being a teenage girl who should by now know how to do those things. She was also taught to fight with the claw shield and talon blade, so when news of the Demon Lord's tournament reached her people, they knew it was time. Talazia was taken by the tribal elder to an ancient sacred mural of a falcon swooping down to kill an evil spider. Her role in the prophecy suddenly clear, Talazia says farewell to her adopted family and heads to face Zarak and the demon inhabiting him. When she emerges victorious, her memory floods back to her. 7 years ago, she was sent as a spy to investigate the Demon Lord, but in retreating from her mission, she was shot down by foul magic that changed her from her true form into a human. Her true form of a falcon, dun dun dun. I have no idea who the master who sent Talazia out to spy on Zarak/Wraith is, nor what the hell is going on in this panel where she reassumes her falcon form. I think it might be Zarak's dead body impaled by her talon blade, but I have no idea what this metal tongue is, nor why he is crushed beneath the weight of a giant baguette. Talazia flies back home to her master, swooping by the village to pay respects to the people that took her in, and considering that she may someday return to human form to once again walk among them. Of all the ploddingly slow fighters in this game, Bane is the ploddingest and slowest. I don't know why so often the huge dude with the huge weapon in a fighting game only hits his opponent with the dinky handle, or only attacks while pretending to have T-Rex arms. Maybe it's a balance thing. I'd prefer easy to dodge attacks with big arcs that do a lot of damage me. But here's Bane as a stunning example of exactly that, preferring to hit you with everything but the head of his hammer like he's 2000's Triple H. Which is a shame because he looks like this and his name is Bane. Mazel tov! Now, you and I already know that Bane is secretly Kor's brother King, which his arcade mode teaser hints at very nicely while telling the story of how he slaughtered the leader of a saber-toothed wolf pack and made his head into a cool hat. We also learned that when he was captured that fateful night, King was tormented by visions of the Demon Lord and made him a target of his fury since then. Seizing Zarak in a goozle, Bane holds him aloft and taunts him, then tears at his throat. He goes to Garth Marenghi's dark place. Blood? Blood. And drops to his knees, removing his wolf mask and singing an ancient battle hymn of his people. Kor recognizes the song and the beginnings of the sacred tattoo on his face and tries to approach his brother, but Bane puts his mask back on and says the king is dead, that he is a lost warrior without a soul, doomed to tread the cursed path, to walk for miles inside a pit of danger, swallowing down 1,000 years of anger with the weight of the world falling upon his shoulders, a place where no one follows him. He walks alone! moving on. Everything started coming up Zorn when the warrior thief went tomb raiding with his bros and discovered an ivory axe and mysterious orc skull, there are orcs in this now I guess, that he thought would serve well as a shield. However, like some kind of reversed He-Man, when he held the weapon and shield aloft, he was filled with a paranoid rage. Certain his fellows wanted to steal his new toys, he slaughtered them all as the eyes of the skull shield and his own began to glow blood red. Zorn no longer wanted to be a plucky thief, he wanted battle and glory. He entered the Dragon Tournament and ascended the ranks so swiftly that the Demon Lord gave him a bye into his own tournament. Barbarians have a lot of tournaments, I guess, or maybe it just happened to be Barbarian Evo, I don't know. Zorn fights exactly how you'd expect Bane to, with long reach and heavy strikes on most of his attacks, proving that at least in this case balance wasn't the issue, and for whatever reason they just decided to cuck Bane.
I have dreams too!
My favorite special of Zorn's is the Axe Yeet, a move he undoubtedly used to ascend to his position of honor among the tournament scene. Despite Zarak's favor, Zorn is filled with hatred for the Demon Lord and is driven to slaughter him when the tournament is complete. It is only at this time that the shield reveals itself to be the skull of an orc general serving under the Demon Wraith, who the opening crawl led me to believe was the one possessing Zarak. This whole time I've been working under the impression that they were the same entity, or the more likely explanation that at some point during development Zarak's name was Wraith and they forgot to change the opening text, but no. Here we are. As the ending text itself says, none of it makes any sense. Wraith rises from the nearby Great Pit of Sin, collects the skull shield, and gets to moseying while Zorn throws a little pity party for himself for getting hoodwinked by a skull full of demons. On to my favorite character to play, Jen Tai, a warrior queen with incredible prowess who fought with honor and refused to kill her opponents unless absolutely necessary. Her father taught her everything she knows, but he never returned from his last campaign, and since his sword was sent home to his family, Jen Tai assumed him dead. With it, she became the greatest fighter in the lands and earned a spot in Zarak's tournament, which made her sad because she realized she'd probably have to kill him when she won. Which is some subtly badass shit. Oh, the Demon Lord has offered me entry into his tournament. I don't think this guy's gonna let me spare his life when I hand him his ass on a plate. Lame. In a surprise twist, when she defeats Zarak, he isn't revealed to secretly be her father. Instead, she just revolutionizes the tournament circuit and stops all the killing so people can bask in the glory of fighting honorably. Since that ending is kind of underwhelming, the game treats us to the sting of this face and the threat that there may be a greater evil than Zarak still lurking out there somewhere. The final combatant selectable without a password is Devada, one of the most visually arresting members of the roster with her gray skin and slashy tattoos. As a youth, she craved the power of sorcery, but only the males in her family were allowed to pursue the arcane arts, so she was cast into the slave mines for her impudence. Like any good enemy of the patriarchy, Devada continued to practice her magic in secret until she was able to break free of the pits and control her father. Unfortunately, she took it too far and also murdered all of her brothers, an act which set her even farther along the path to evilness. It also nearly killed her, saved only by the power in her family's heirloom magic orb. Unable to leave the castle until the orb was slaked with the energy of enough fresh kills, Devada used her magic to draw unwary travelers into her lair and sacrifice them to the orb. Finally strong enough to make her exit, she enters the tournament hoping to rip out the heart of Zarak himself and use it to sever her dependency on the orb. Devada fights with a double-bladed sword that also serves as her magic staff. Much like Bane, her attacks are shorter range than you'd expect, but she makes up for it with projectiles and teleports, and she's regarded by the internet as the best character in the game for this reason. If you agree, it should be a snap for you to defeat Zarak and allow Devada to absorb his soul, freeing her from the orb and granting her the power to rule the world as a cruel tyrant of sorcery. So let's talk Zarak. He's got some good final boss energy, evil spider armor, decent normals, decent specials. He's not quite Shao Kahn, but he's pretty cool, and he's playable, which was still kinda noteworthy at the time for a boss character. Looking into Zarak's backstory via arcade mode, it becomes apparent that it wasn't so much that he randomly decided to not pursue children born from the Skull Hand Blood Moon Hook car door, but that he tried and his wizards weren't good enough to figure out who they all were. So he settled on them finding the best ones, which were the Tarok twins, Kor, and King. Sweet, says Zarak. Go run their fades. I'm not coming just in case they're good enough to kill me now. That, of course, turned out to be a huge misstep as the twins slaughtered the shit out of his men. Zarak immediately realized the error of his ways. He had broken the warrior's code of always facing your opponent in honorable one-on-one combat, a lesson taught to him by the man who trained him to fight before he got possessed by demons or whatever. Vowing to never break the code again, he sets things in motion for his eventual tournament, which he wins, of course. If you don't kill Bane and Kor, you get a partial ending where Zarak reigns supreme and declares there is no weapon lord. But if you do, in the grand tradition of shittier secret endings, Zarak goes through a long, drawn-out explanation of events that it was in fact Wraith who ordered Zarak not to interfere with the prophecy, and they fought to the death 7 years ago with Zarak emerging as victor. In the present, Zarak's sentient spider armor, whose name is Recluse by the way, absolutely astonishing, informs him that he too was born under the warrior's blood moon, and he is the true weapon lord. There's the briefest of celebrations before Wraith hauls his happy ass up out of the sin pit and says,
"The prophecy has not yet been fulfilled. I have been waiting to take back what is mine. It is now time for you to accept your punishment, Zarak. But don't worry, this time I won't underestimate you, son."
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. This is one of the dumbest things I've read in a fighting game in a long time, especially with all the effort gone into building up to the reveal. Assuming you don't just grab codes off the internet, you need to beat the story mode with every character in order to get the pieces of it, and in doing so, collect the relevant clues that you need to actually kill Core and Bane in the process of Zarak's story mode. It's actually built pretty well, encourages replay, and is just the right amount of obtuse. And given the way it's all structured, you even get the questions popping up between the opening of the game and the various endings. It's organic. It's actually well done. But then you get to the ultimate ending, and OMG WTF BBQ Wraith is Zarak's dad. What an inconsequential stinger. Hilarious. Nobody could actually care. Maybe if Zarak weren't equally as evil, or it was revealed that Wraith was Jen Tai's father, which he actually might be, given some hints in the plot. Or killing Wraith merely freed him from his flesh prison, and all the bloodshed of the tournament granted him greater power in his unbound form, or something. This would be a revelation of consequence. But no, this is nothing. Absurd, delightful 90s nonsense. Allow me to cast your minds back to my high school days. The year is likely 1999 or 2000 because I was rarely an early adopter of anything, and I'm hanging out with one of my friends. There's not a great way to say this, but he's that guy. The one you're not sure exactly why you're friends with because he's kind of a self-important jerk, but every now and then he manages to act like a really decent human being, and he has a lot of cool games nobody's ever heard of. He's the guy who's playing Star Ocean instead of Final Fantasy, Darkstalkers instead of Street Fighter, and instead of Tekken, Bloody Roar. I'm Eric J. Chucky, and welcome to Violent Profiles, where we discuss obscure fighting games and the rosters that define them. I suppose none of those games are exactly obscure in modern context, but for my slice of the world, growing up in a small town, they had that smack of the exotic more than your Tomb Raiders, Mortal Kombats, and Super Marios. The sort of games you typically only get to read about in the small articles of gaming magazines because none of your local non-chain rental places have a copy. In a time before YouTube, getting the opportunity to explore these games was enough social lubricant to keep me hanging out with someone who intentionally rubbed me the wrong way. 1997's Bloody Roar was the first fighting game developed by Raising, now known as Aiding. Before this, they made one of my least favorite genres, shoot-em-ups, and since then they've done a lot of work with Capcom and released a number of licensed anime fighters. The sequel, Bloody Roar 2: The New Breed, or Bringer of the New Age in Europe and Japan, landed in 1999, and we'll be talking about both today, with the remaining entries probably coming sometime in the distant future. The plot is fairly straightforward. There are secret beings in the world known as zoanthropes, who appear like normal humans but possess the power to turn into animal-person hybrids at will. The evil Tylon Corporation seeks to exploit these powerful individuals, and a ragtag group of heroes aims to stop them. Hang on. Have I mentioned before how much I hate 5th-gen console graphics? Even at the time. They weren't so bad after about the year 2000, but the early days were just unfortunate. I mean, look at these models. This is supposed to be the sizzle reel, the attract mode. This is supposed to make you want to play the game. It's supposed to look good. I got in so many fights with my peers because I preferred pixel art and sprites long after 3D made its mark because so much 3D looked like this. Anyhow, spoiler alert, the protagonists succeed in thwarting the evil corporation. In the second game, which takes place 5 years later, they're forced to confront the consequences of their actions. Taking down Tylon has alerted the world at large to the existence of zoanthropes. In response to this, an underground organization named the Zoanthrope Liberation Front forms, claiming to fight for zoanthrope rights. But the second they get an inch of power, they reveal themselves to be a zoanthrope supremacist group and engage in global terrorism to that end. Looks like it's time for our heroes to return. Fortunately, the graphics during play weren't half as bad as the cutscenes, the soundtrack was banging, and most importantly, the gameplay itself felt smooth. Despite its open arenas and general visual style, Bloody Roar 1 and 2 are largely 2D fighters, barring the effects of some moves. It's only through unlocking a special mode that you can use a button to strafe your opponent. Even without this option, it's a competent and fun game with lots of combos. The fighters move pretty fluidly for PS1, the minimal buttons and nearly universal inputs between characters keeping the action simple while managing the various gauges and defensive tactics, and then of course, there's Beast Mode. Tap into your inner undead centurion and become part animal, giving you more options for attack and the ability to recover health. You can even enter Beast Rave to amp up the speed and remove the cooldown timer for combos, allowing you to air juggle your opponents into oblivion, though this is removed from the sequel in favor of a powerful special attack called Beast Drive and a more robust defense system. Hang on, White here from the editing room. There's a couple of things I didn't talk about in the original script that bear mentioning, like how Hudson was the publisher and IP holder for the franchise. I'd be remiss if I didn't confess that the version of the plot I present here is curtailed. If you care about the multitude of twists, turns, and surprise reveals, give it a Google or check out the game yourself. Obviously the gameplay's worth it. Finally, these names, man, some of them change depending on your region. You might better remember Hans as Fox or Sheena as Marvel. Sometimes the original translations don't match the eventual official names, though that's hardly anything new to the 90s. My last little bugaboo from the future, I try to get proper pronunciations for these names to be as respectful as I can, but a bunch of them seem to have straight up been invented by the designers. Bertri and Busuzima, for example, only return hits about Bloody Roar. The franchise has its idiosyncrasies, is all I'm saying, and thus so does this video. Now back to your regularly scheduled programming. Yugo Ogami is Bloody Roar's protagonist, a boxer who can turn into a wolf. I didn't play him much when I was younger because the only association I had with the name Yugo was the legendarily shitty budget card, and I assumed that meant he was also a subpar character. Turns out he's actually a pretty good all-rounder with some cool moves and combos, and while you can see the boxing influence in his punches, he's not a Balrog what's a kick kind of character, or even a bob and weave type like Tekken's Steve Fox. Yugo was told his father was killed in the war, but recently he's been questioning this, especially following the revelation that his zoanthropy is genetic. Yugo believes Tylon is responsible for whatever happened to his father, so he storms the place with his dad's old mercenary buddy Gato. We'll get to him in a minute. They break into the main Tylon lab and find it full of zoanthropes and giant glowing cylinders, but Yugo's dad is nowhere to be found. Gato, and I cannot stress the specificity of this enough, gets a weird look on his face, and Yugo interprets that to mean that Tylon killed his father. He vows unceasing revenge that he already got because Tylon is no more, and walks off into the sunset. Why did Gato not tell him sooner if he knew? And if he didn't, why did they just assume him not being in one of the tubes meant he was killed by Tylon? Anime logic is weird. Instead of getting that impossible revenge he vowed, Yugo tries to hide his zoanthrope nature and becomes a boxer with dreams of going pro. Keeping him company during this time is Kenji, a boy Yugo found during their raid on Tylon and adopted as a younger brother when he discovered the boy had no surviving family. The kid gets kidnapped by the Zoanthrope Liberation Front and brainwashed into becoming a ninja assassin working for them, kicking off the events of Bloody Roar 2. Yugo saves his brother, de-brainwashes him, and at the suggestion of Gato, forms the World of Coexistence movement to bring humans and zoanthropes together in harmony. I do like how interconnected the stories of the various fighters are, but it doesn't do a lot of favors for the typical pseudo-list format of this show. So instead of repeating myself about the other principal characters, let's hit everyone from the first Bloody Roar that doesn't make an appearance in the second. Mitsuko Nanomura is a fun one, both for transforming into a boar of all things and having a very open wrestling-based fighting style. Much like Yugo, it doesn't dominate her attacks, she has a good strike game and isn't just an extended series of command grabs. Mitsuko is the mother of Yuriko from Bloody Roar 2, and the second her daughter starts showing signs of zoanthropy, she's snatched up by Tylon for their experiments. Of course, being a determined and protective woman, Mitsuko refuses to stand for that and fights to free her daughter from Tylon's clutches, aided by fellow fighter Alice. Fine victory with her, and we get to see mother and daughter reunited in the loving embrace of mediocre CGI. Aww. But also ew. My old favorite character in the first Bloody Roar was the Fox, Hans Taubman. Playing him again 25 years later with his agile, low-damage fighting style, I can affirm that I likely only enjoyed him because of the whole psychotic androgyny thing. Please see my interest in characters like Vega, Kefka, Marvel's Loki, and so on. Foxes are also a pretty cool animal, although Hans would disagree. He thinks his zoanthrope form is ugly and that all ugliness in the world must be purged. He made his bones as an assassin for Tylon until he was killing some people for fun in an alley somewhere and detected the scent of zoanthropy in one among them, an older woman. He demanded she shift and give him a real fight, but she refused and apologized for the terrible job she did as a mother, calling him by name. Hans seems either heartbroken that he killed his own mother, or confused that he hadn't already killed his own mother, but then he laughs it off and is never seen again. Quite literally, the first Bloody Roar was his only appearance. Was he killed when Tylon was destroyed? Did he snap and run off into the desert? Did killing his own mother sober him up and lead him to apply for a job doing insurance adjustments? Who could know? Next up is the president of the world, G from Street Fighter V. Greg. Greg Jones. What a compelling name. Greg is a gorilla man whose wrestling style is much more full of command grabs than anyone else, though they have less to do with wrestling moves and more with tossing your opponent around like Donkey Kong. Greg runs a circus. I don't know why he is here. Legitimately, I'm not sure why he's involved in the storyline of Bloody Roar. His ending has him asking Yugo to join the circus, and Yugo gets annoyed with him and suggests if he wants a zoanthrope to star in a circus, Greg himself should be the one to do it. And it honestly seems like this is the first time Greg considered this idea, so he does. The end. You can knock his little top hat off during the fight. That is all there is to know about Greg. In contrast, Bakuryu is an interesting character. Real name Ryuzo Kato, he's another assassin for the Tylon Corporation with the ability to turn into a mole. He's got fast attacks and ninja teleport, and I really like that out the gate, one of the first concepts Bloody Roar went with was Ninja Mole. Bakuryu's ambitions are to become the strongest fighter in the world. To this end, he allows Tylon to experiment on him as much as possible, and he proves his superiority by crushing even his fellow zoanthropic opponents. If you defeat the game with him, in the middle of triumphant boasting, his molecular structure begins to fail, and he melts into a pile of greenish-black goo while begging not to die. This was, of course, exactly what Tylon expected, and the scientists resolved to move on to the next phase of testing. On one hand, I like that all the endings in Bloody Roar seem to be canon, and there isn't some ambiguous version of events that isn't resolved until the next entry in the series like so many other fighting games. On the other, it must suck to beat the game with your favorite dude only to watch him cry betrayal while dissolving into a particularly gothic batch of Nickelodeon gack. Ah, but wait, you shout. Bakuryu is back in Bloody Roar 2. And so he is. This Bakuryu is actually the aforementioned Kenji, adopted brother of Yugo. Kenji was found in a lab in a vegetative state due to an incomplete mind control procedure. Having lost his parents when he was young, Kenji was taken by the original Bakuryu and trained in the same ninja arts, working in tandem on assassination missions for Tylon. He was set to inherit the title of Bakuryu when everything fell apart and the events of the first game took place. The remnants of Tylon within the Zoanthrope Liberation Front flip the switch on Kenji's mind after kidnapping him and use him as a tool of their supremacist agenda until Yugo and Gato break that control and Kenji is once again his own man. Speaking of, Alan Gato, the legendary mercenary, comes off as a slightly edgier French Guile from Street Fighter. He's got a similar stiff, deliberate combat style, although I don't remember Guile ever turning into a badass lion? Gato confronts Tylon in order to discover the whereabouts of his fallen comrade, Yugo's father, Yuji. In perhaps the most surprising subversion of any fighting game ever, Yuji is actually dead, though not from injuries suffered in the war, but instead at the hands of experiments by the Tylon Corporation. Gato burns the whole thing down, quite literally, and in light of their exposure to the masses, vows to start an organization to bring peace between humans and zoanthropes so this never happens again. His disappearance following this causes rumors to circulate that Gato is the leader of the Zoanthrope Liberation Front terrorist organization, though nothing could be further from the truth. Joining forces with his old allies, he takes down the ZLF and becomes a dignitary in the United Nations who pushes for equality among all peoples. If anyone could challenge Yugo's position as the protagonist of Bloody Roar, it's Alice Tsukagami. Kidnapped at a young age, experimented on, and trained to fight by the Tylon Corporation, Alice escaped before she could be programmed as a good little soldier. She's a kind and gentle soul, but that doesn't erase her ability to turn into a giant white bunny and literally rabbit punch her enemies into orbit, making her one of the more iconic characters in the franchise. There's a lot of really great synergy in her design, too. An experiment of Tylon, who is the kind of white rabbit you'd find undergoing testing in a shady laboratory, with her Wonderland-esque name and an alternate outfit in Bloody Roar, referencing Usagi of Sailor Moon. Alice was determined to free the person instrumental in her escape, Mitsuko's daughter Yuriko. The pair manage it despite Tylon having used their tech to temporarily transform the little girl into an adult competitor with psychokinetic powers in a chimeric zoanthrope form. After saving Yuriko, Alice is adopted by the Nonomura family. In the 5 years between games, she graduates high school and begins practicing as a nurse. She's surprised to find an unconscious Yugo as one of her patients, but once initial medical attention is given, he wakes up and leaves in a huff, determined to find Kenji's kidnappers. Alice follows in a bid to force him to see logic and let his wounds heal, but she's interrupted by Gato, who initially offers her the position as the figurehead of the unified world of zoanthropes and humans for her fighting spirit and compassionate attitude. Alice declines, citing her responsibility to the patients she already has. Long Shin is a conflicted character. A former assassin who's done business for Tylon and a master of Xingyi Quan, Long has the ability to turn into a tiger, but he resents this aspect of himself and fights against it. As someone who could kill an opponent in an instant using only his bare hands, Long was a valuable member to his former organization, and they often sent operatives to coax him back into the fold. Unfortunately for them, Long has no attachments, having abandoned his abusive family after his loving mother passed away, so there's little left to bargain with him over. Determined to atone for his shady past, Long strikes out to destroy Tylon, but even after it lies in rubble, he cannot find peace. The beast within seems to have taken on a persona of its own and urges him to shift and sow destruction. Instead, Long seals himself in a cave. More of a principal character in the sequel, Lon is drawn out of his cave by Yuriko Nanomura, who wants proper martial arts training to recover her mother who was recently kidnapped by the Zoanthrope Liberation Front. The bad guys in these games sure do love kidnapping. Despite once being a final boss level powerful warrior, the experimental mutations seem to have worn off in the absence of Tylon, or something, and she's now only able to turn into an even more humanoid feline form than other Zoanthropes. This doesn't stop her from being one of my favorite fighters in Bloody Roar 2, with a style very reminiscent of Ling Xiaoyu's from Tekken. Yuriko is said to practice Kenpo instead of Ling's Bagua Zhang, but I'm not sure that's accurate, especially given the latter's close association with her teacher's own Jing Yi Quan. Yuriko's mother is rescued, and her part in Bloody Roar 2's story ends riding bikes with Kenji, but Long is forced to confront something altogether more horrible. A cloned version of himself created by Tylon, who is given in to the beast within, the true leader of the Zoanthrope Liberation Front, Shenlong. Long confronts this monster and finds himself envious. Shenlong is without the restriction of guilt and nobility, and in that freedom he easily bests Long and has him at his mercy. Long accepts his death, but something about that peace troubles Shenlong. Are the things he was created without, the things that make Long imperfect, truly weaknesses? Can he attain true strength if he never has to overcome his own shortcomings? I mean, yeah, probably. Those questions don't make a whole lot of sense, but given Tylon's track record with stability in their experiments, it isn't much of a surprise that their clone of the greatest living martial artist isn't so great at drawing logical conclusions. Shenlong rips his own chest open and collapses, leaving Long to decide his own fate. Gato, of course, asks if he wants to be the leader of the world of coexistence and stand among the people as an icon of integrity, but Long declines. He will remain among the people, but not in a public role, and as a human, still in denial of his zoanthropy. This leaves us with our final four characters, the ones completely new to Bloody Roar 2, the titular new breed. Let's start with the fighting marvel Sheena Gato, adopted daughter of the legendary mercenary Alan, which is a curious tendency in this game. None of the principal characters who are family are blood except Yuriko and Mitsuko. I think that's awesome, both in that the characters of this game are portrayed to have so much love in their hearts to accept wayward souls as part of their family, and that real-life adopted children could look to these characters for representation in a time where that wasn't a goal for designers the same way it is today. But it is a weirdly prevalent trend. Regardless, Sheena wants to follow in her adopted father's footsteps, but despite her incredible talents, he doesn't want to see her make the same mistakes he has. Predictably defiant, she immediately severs ties with him following high school and becomes a mercenary in her own right, using her similar fighting style to her father and leopard zoanthropy to make her way in the world as a soldier for hire. However, when it becomes rumored that the elder Gato is the man behind the insidious ZLF terrorist cell, Sheena is determined to find the truth, which, as we know, is that he's not their leader and is instead fighting for world peace and asking literally everyone he comes across if they want to be the president of his cool new club. The two reconcile, and Alan suggests they fight together for a change. Next up is Jenny Berdery, a curious femme fatale and mysterious source of information along the lines of Trinity from The Matrix, Marvel's Black Widow, or, well, Rouge the Bat.
How's it going?
Her zoanthrope form is noteworthy in that she looks less like a chiropteran humanoid and more like what if Felicia from Darkstalkers was a bat instead of a cat, complete with carefully shaved hair for maximum sexiness. At least, I have to assume that's what it's for. Nobody else busts out all naked in their beast mode. I can't claim this is my kink exactly, but to each their own. Perhaps her unusual transformation is what led to speculation that Jenny isn't your typical zoanthrope, but instead a Hungarian vampire hiding under the guise of a secret agent/model. Her moves carry some similar spirit to Hans the Fox from the original Bloody Roar, but I feel like she's executed much better, with flying attacks and kicks taking advantage of those long legs. And of course, she has some sweet Taekwondo moves, which earns points for me. Jenny's involvement in the story is minimal. Gato invites her to join him in taking down the Zoanthrope Liberation Front, and she eventually accepts, but she's very coy about it and refuses to take payment. The two hint at a bit of a romance, but that's about it. Another product of Tylon, Steven Goldberg was a scientist in their employ until he discovered the wickedness they were up to. He tried to expose them, but before he could get far, he was subjected to the same experiments he used to run, and worse. Transformed into an unstable artificial zoanthrope beetle, Steven rechristened himself as Stun and vowed to take down the remnants of Tylon in the Zoanthrope Liberation Front. With his help, it was destroyed, but as much as smarmy teenagers and 20-somethings would have you believe life sucks and then you die, the truth is life sucks and then you keep on living. Making his peace with this, Stun uses his powers to literally prey upon the criminal element of the world, feeding on their blood to stabilize his decaying body. Interestingly, Stun occupies Greg's old slot in Bloody Roar 2, a grapple-focused wrestler. As much as I love Beetles, I wasn't a huge fan of his fighting style, but a lot of his beast mode normals are pretty satisfying. Finally, we come to Hajime Busuzima, perhaps one of the most unique characters in either game. Once again, going for an esoteric pileup of concepts like Surf Bro Chameleon Mad Scientist is not what I would have expected so early in the franchise, especially when more traditionally popular Japanese animals like goats, mice, bears, turtles, and any birds or aquatic creatures are unexplored. Busuzima's fighting style is listed as Deception, and he has a unique approach to combat with access to multiple stances that modify his attacks. Of course, in zoanthrope form, he can turn invisible and has almost Dulcim-like reach with his limbs and tongue, but my favorite part is the fact that if you press nothing on the controller, he slowly creeps toward the opponent.
Yeah, I'ma get you.
As for his role in the story, young Busuzima was fascinated by insects and what made them move. He would frequently dissect them and try to figure it out, but of course upon being taken apart, they stopped moving. His grandmother admonished him for his actions, explaining that taking the bugs apart is what made them stop moving, and before long, she stopped moving as well. Loneliness followed in her death, and Busuzima became obsessed with the concept of immortality. His analytical, creative, scientifically oriented mind made him a ripe candidate for employment with Tylon. It was he who pushed many of their more controversial experiments, including turning Steven Goldberg into the first artificial zoanthrope. It was he who set up Shenlong as the leader of the ZLF, and it was he who finally answered at the hands of the heroes at the end of Bloody Roar 2, his body battered and his organizations destroyed. Bloody Roar 2 is my last personal experience with the franchise, though I'm aware there were 3 more sequels that followed, and I'm interested to see how they unfolded. I'd love to see a resurgence of this title, or at least one last entry to celebrate its legacy. What surprised me most about revisiting Bloody Roar wasn't how well the mechanics held up or the interwoven storyline, but more that playing the first game brought back very strong feelings of nostalgia, even more than the fighters I'd spent much more time on in my youth. Whether we made very good friends back then or would make good friends today, I'm grateful for the time I spent pressing buttons with that guy and games like Bloody Roar he introduced me to. In early 2018, I was producing a video series exploring fighting game characters called Violent Profiles. You may have heard of it. There was no buffer. Each episode was ideated, scripted, recorded, edited, and uploaded as I managed to find time, which meant there was nothing in the way of a proper upload schedule. We also didn't have the biggest fan base at the time, since the Bloodstorm video hadn't dropped yet, but those who were invested I was very grateful to have, just like today. For some reason, this seems like a good time to remind you guys you can get episodes a month early by subscribing at the $5 tier on Patreon, and that liking, commenting, subscribing, and sharing the videos actually does help the channel out. Anyway, also in early 2018, the Game Grumps did a one-off episode of a Super Nintendo fighting game, and wouldn't you know it, a fan of the show requested I cover these bizarre characters. I was determined to deliver, but sitting down to actually play the busted old fighter was proving a difficult task, never mind the real-life distractions that ultimately terminated the original series entirely. Well, it might have taken over 5 years, but we're finally getting to it. I'm Eric J. Chucky, and welcome to Violent Profiles, where we discuss obscure fighting games and the rosters that define them. Today we're talking about power moves, known to Japanese gamers as Power Athlete, or if you prefer Sega systems, Deadly Moves. We're gonna stick with power moves for simplicity's sake. Developed in 1992 by System Vision, a studio so popular they don't have a Wikipedia page, and published by Kaneko, who are perhaps best known for producing 2 Chester Cheetah licensed games.
It ain't easy being cheesy.
There's not a lot one can really say about what is a painfully obvious Street Fighter II clone released 1 year later, except for talking about how bad it is. Let's start with the jump button. Yes, I said jump button. Instead of just hitting up on the D-pad, one of your face buttons is mapped to jump. Now I know, it's an early fighting game, the rules weren't established yet, and most other games at the time had dedicated jump buttons, I know. But it's still a subpar control scheme within the genre, except for platform fighters like Smash Bros. And a platform fighter, this ain't. Of course, there's a reason there's a dedicated jump button. Pressing up on the D-pad allows you to move a little bit into the background, kinda like a beat-em-up, which could be cool, except that the game isn't really programmed to take advantage of it. Most attacks still hit no matter where you are, and there's so little depth that it's trivial for the opponent to just follow you. So this largely useless depth of field thing causes another deviation from your typical fighting game formula. You have to be able to move back down, so there is a lack of a crouch button. Combine this with the fact that only 3 of your possible 6 buttons do anything, since Deadly Moves was a Genesis title first, and you will discover your attack options are punch, kick, jumping punch, jumping kick, and 2 special moves. Some fighters also get a throw. And as though all that wasn't bad enough, the opponent is invincible after being hit in midair, so you can't even get a few extra follow-up attacks until they get back up. There's also no chip damage, so if your foe decides to stonewall, they just get to. Ordinarily in such a scenario, in almost any other fighting game, I'd just throw them. But Joe here only seems to throw people when he really feels like it. Now I know what you're thinking. I self-identify as not very good at fighting games. That's why this show is about the characters more than the mechanics. But here I am talking my fool head off about the mechanics. Why? Well, for 2 reasons. 1, the story mode concerns Joe and only Joe, both in the sense that you can't play as anyone else, and also that his name is solely Joe. Not Joe Black, not Joe Green, not Joe Higashi, not Joe Usler or Joe Bruce, not Sniper Joe, not Mighty Joe Young, not even friggin' Joe Jonas. Just Joe. So the details we have on the other characters are very minimal. Joe's own story is as shallow as a kiddie pool, and I'd like for this video to be longer than 5 minutes. Reason 2 is because I did in fact try to play through the story mode in order to give you an honest evaluation of its most unique feature, an RPG mechanic. As you fight through the great value world warriors on your path to be the best or whatever, you gain stat ups that make Joe a more competent fighter. But in order to do that, I'd have to best the unbeatable first boss of the game, the asylum demon of power moves, Warren. One would assume this thick-bodied chap is a Glass Joe caliber jobber. He even looks like Gabby J from Super Punch-Out! Yay! In a game with minimal mechanics, the first challenge should be a cakewalk where you just get used to the controls. I wouldn't call myself tournament ready by any stretch, but I understand the basics of fighting games, and there's not a lot of depth to power moves in the first place, but... well...
You lose!
Finally, I managed to beat him, thanks in no small part to him literally launching himself into the way of my attack. Here's the level up screen, and here's me getting my ass handed to me immediately afterward by a dancing man wielding castanets. Speaking of which, I've teased this game's characters enough. Let's get into the meat of why we're here. Bare-bones stories about why weird-looking guys from all over the world want to bash each other's brains in. The central conceit of the world of power moves is that more mundane sports like football and football are becoming passé. People want violence, and nobody wants violence more than our main character Joe, who has been secretly training since he was a child to become the greatest fighter in the world. Despite his growing impatience, Joe continues to train until he's approached by an old man who, like an NPC in an NES JRPG, announces apropos of nothing that there are many martial arts masters in the world. This broad statement of fact being offered to him unprovoked by a mysterious octogenarian inspires Joe to travel the world and train under these masters, until he hears word of a champion in the new, fierce, unnamed fighting sport who has kicked all of the asses of all of the greatest fighters. He thinks, that's how I prove I'm the best, beating that guy, and leaves his home in small-town America to do so. Joe is a karate guy who can do an overly dramatic and difficult to aim anti-air kick and shoot a fireball while shouting what sounds like, "Whoa, shit!" Which is probably what I would also shout if I could suddenly unleash flaming spirit energy from my hands. And it makes me think of this comic panel, which makes me laugh. If you beat the game with him, and he's the only one you have the option to, you get blue text on a black background announcing, "You are #1 fighter," before fading into a picture of Joe holding a golden snake corpse aloft with an expression of dull surprise.
Dull surprise!
The manual's a little more well-translated than the in-game text, offering the idea that Joe's initial training was getting him nowhere, especially with the appearance of the fighting champion who broke all the records and took what Joe believed to be his spot. The old man also doesn't just shout out facts about the existence of martial artists, but discloses to Joe that there are secret fighting masters, which would have also been a fine name for the game in any region, inspiring Joe to challenge them and learn their deadly moves to become the ultimate champion. Next is the aforementioned terror of the high seas, Warren. He's apparently from Hawaii, and he has seen some shit. In his youth, Warren was the subject of ridicule for his cowardice until he realized he was frighteningly yoked and began to use that strength to solve all his problems. He has this aerial breakdancing move that's objectively terrible and a decent dash which he apparently calls Big Wednesday. Being as he's built like John Silver's dad, it's appropriate he has a very wrestling-inspired fighting style with huge drop kicks and flying elbows. Buo is our next combatant, or if you translate his name from the original Japanese, Dance King. He claims to be a representative of Kabuki theater, but is in fact a direct descendant of assassins from the Boshin War. He's described as having inherited the killing techniques of ninjutsu, kung fu, karate, aikido, and kobudo, which translates into a big kick and a jumping uppercut that's useless against anyone below him. I guess red comes out of him when he attacks, increasing his range a bit. He can teleport backward with a smoke bomb and hit people with his hair, which requires pressing 3 buttons compared to the 1 for his big kick, and has a startup animation and shorter range. At least you fight him on this cool snowy Shinto shrine stage. I dig the parallax. Hailing from China, Gao Luan has some impressive reach and probably the most cromulent move list in the game. He has a strong projectile throwing his twin boomerang daggers which can hit on the return, and a flash kick-like move that feels like a better anti-air than Joe's Supernova by virtue of still being able to hit stuff on the ground. The manual only mentions he's mastered the Northern Chinese fighting style, which is probably meant to indicate why he's so acrobatic and better at striking with his legs. His name might also translate to Gowron, and he seems to have the title 100 Dragons, which is a pretty sick thing to be called if you're just one regular human guy. Next up, she's Rayon in the game, Li Yong in the manual where her portrait is backward and still bears her in-game name written over it, and Li Young if you Google translate the original Japanese. But of all the things she is, she's definitely not Chun-Li. Ignore the buns and the similar outfit, ignore the fact that the manual says she was born and raised in China, her stage is in Thailand, see? And she absolutely doesn't have the move diversity of the lightning-kicking Interpol officer. Her shooting down kick is just an upward strike that's awkward to land no matter the situation, though her dash has a few frames afterward where she withdraws from the attack, which I kind of like to get out of danger on a block. Besides, The manual outright states that she's the only female fighter in the world, so not only is she not Chun-Li, but there is no Chun-Li. In fact, no female has ever fought anything before or since Rayon, and if anyone tells you differently, they're a filthy liar. Speaking of people who definitely aren't other people, here's a guy who took zero inspiration from Street Fighter's Blanca, Baraki Chimera. Setting aside the questionable racial sensitivity of 90s Japan, I kind of like his design actually. I like his mohawk and piercings, I like that he's sporting the juiciest of rips, and I dig his color scheme. His normals aren't much to write home about, but his fireball and rolling dash attack are pretty exceptional. Baraki is apparently the leader of the fictitious Kenyan Opa Opa tribe, and a member of the secret organization Junk. Whatever that means. Another member of Junk, Nick here looks like some kind of badass pirate or street tough on the select screen, but when you get into battle with him, he's a lot more Catholic Piccolo? I really don't know what's going on here. He's supposed to be a matador who impressed Junk with his quick reflexes, but this is only a matador outfit if it was described to the artist via a game of telephone. Similarly, when he wins a match or throws his knives, he shouts "Ole" to drive home his Spanish heritage, only he says it like someone who's never heard the word pronounced before, so it sounds more like "hold it." You might be asking why Nick throws knives when the traditional weapon of the matador is the short spear, fool that you are. The manual actually covers this, mentioning he discovered he can use knives as well as he can a spear. So there. Nick's other move is a pair of chain capoeira attacks, the traditional means of defeating a bull, and his stage is an endless elevator ascending above a post-apocalyptic city, as you would expect from an expert torero. The final playable character is undoubtedly the one you've all been waiting for, Vagnad Rovnovsky. But keep your snickering to yourself, his name is a mistranslation. It's actually a name with a respected history that I managed to find several instances of with a quick Google search. So, clean the egg off your face and put some respect on the man's true name, Bagnad. Baltesty Skrotovsky hails from Russian, and until recently was a political prisoner forced to fight other prisoners to the death. When the government holding him collapsed, Nutbag Sakovich found the techniques he learned in the fighting pits brought him a new understanding of martial arts. These include a pretty bitchin' spinning lariat, a terrible jumping punch, effortlessly double pile driving someone's skull into the dirt, being blue for no reason, and the dreaded handstand attack, a move which the manual describes but he never performs. Truly, the mysteries of Coin-Pursed Plum Smuglov will stay with us for the rest of time. There's one more character in Power Moves, the final boss who is only playable with a code, the ultimate fighter Joe seeks to test his might against, Rancor. Sadly, as he is the final boss, I have no manual information on him, nor have I managed to find his original Japanese name to know if it was something that makes more sense than Rancor. All I know is that he's also American, Joe's bout against him takes place in front of a crowd of screaming fans, and he's got some pretty decent attacks. The punch wreathed in blue flame is an intimidating spectacle, even though he screams "Thunder Beef" as he performs it. Thunder Beef! But the pièce de résistance is his floor-crawling projectile, released with a plaintive cry of "I don't understand!" Me either, Rancor. Me either. No matter what you call it, this is a very bad game with only an ounce of ambition, and in that way feels like a predecessor to the likes of CRITICOM. Few will remember this game for its almost unique characters or level-up training system, but many will continue to celebrate its confusing ad with inaccurate hand-drawn screenshots and the fact that it has a guy named Vagnad in it for years to come. I grew up during the rise of emulating console games on PC, editing graphics in Nesticle, and playing around with fan-translated copies of games that hadn't hit the States yet, like Final Fantasy V and Pokemon Silver. It's honestly still wild to me that state-of-the-art consoles from that era, like the PlayStation, can be just as easily emulated today. Even owning much more advanced games on Steam, I still get a thrill booting up something I used to spin on a disc or played in the arcade. But the real thrill I got out of emulation was trying out random weird games I'd never heard of before. I guess some things never change. Most of those games didn't leave much of an impression on me. Usually only a few details if they really stood out, like Zigzag Cat Ostrich Club Mo Usawagida, or a mediocre Street Fighter clone featuring a martial arts grandma who threw her teeth at you and transformed into her younger self. Unbeknownst to me, that game had a healthy arcade life well into the aughts and was a hell of a lot better than the SNES port I played back then. Today we're taking a journey back to that weirdness with Power Instinct. I'm Eric J. Chucky, and welcome to Violent Profiles, where we discuss obscure fighting games and the rosters that define them. Atlus dropped Power Instinct in 1993 with a sequel that followed in 1994 and the tag team-based GOKETSUJI Legends in 1995. We're only covering those first 3 games since I'll be splitting the series up into 3 episodes across several seasons of Violent Profiles, since there are 47 characters to explore in total. Thankfully, because the game is very character-driven, there isn't much backstory outside of the fighters themselves. See, one of the things I like about Power Instinct is that the tournament is diegetic. Every 5 years, the GOKETSUJI clan holds a contest of martial prowess to see who controls the family fortune and all the power that comes with it. As such, many of the playable characters are related through the GOKETSUJI bloodline, since that's a prerequisite of eligibility. It's an interesting structure, creates immediate stakes in storytelling, and, I don't know,
I just think they're neat.
I'm getting most of my info off the GOKETSUJI Wikia, so forgive any truthiness and feel free to correct me in the comments. I'm honestly not 100% sure where they got all this information, because citing sources isn't something you have to do on a Wikia. I just couldn't scrounge up a whole lot of independent verification. There are dialogue snippets in-game that help, and the original had character bios that were cut from stateside console ports, unless they were the same as the brief ones in the instruction booklets, which might be what the Wikia has translated. There was also an accompanying manga, though I understand that's of questionable canon. I usually try to source this info myself, but a lot of it is in Japanese, and I don't read Japanese, nor do I trust Google Translate any more than the fans maintaining the Wikia, so we're going to extend a little trust today. Let's go ahead and get Grandma out of the way, and in doing so we'll also talk about her twin sister. Because, believe it or not, they're the main characters of the series. Otane Goketsuji, Tane if you're nasty, had a rough childhood. Apparently, Tane kicked her sister Ume out of the womb first, making her the older of the two. From that day forward, Ume grew to resent everything she saw as representative of her sister. Tane had a sweet, friendly disposition, while Ume preferred uncompromising strength. When the two were only 6, Ume stuffed a sleeping Tane into a box and threw her into the ocean. Miraculously, Tane survived and spent 5 years living with another family under a cloud of amnesia. When her memories returned at age 13, she vowed revenge and returned to Kyoto to confront her sister, but the two's rage was kept at bay by their mother. Tane only stayed 2 years at her family mansion before she could no longer handle her sister's cruelty and what she eventually came to recognize as her mother's indifference. She left again, this time with the intent to train until she surpassed her sister in power. Please understand this woman is 78 years old. She went off to train for 63 years to beat her sister. In that time, Ume got arranged marriage to a fellow named Kanji Kokuin who had nowhere near the patience as Tane and dumped her ass after 2 weeks. At the age of 18, Ume won the Goketsuji tournament, and as of the first game, she has been the leader of the clan ever since. Of course, games have endings and plots between entries. Power Instinct ends with Tane taking control, which both Ume and their mother do not want. Ume literally pulls the box in the ocean gag again with help from her mother, and they throw a new emergency tournament while engaging in some mother-daughter backstabbing for rights to the throne. Tane somehow makes it back to the tournament again and manages to defeat Ume again, but is so exhausted by all this that she's easily surpassed by Kanji. Immediately after seizing the Goketsuji clan, he opens another tournament just for funsies with a cool prize on the line. Both sisters enter for this one, Tane feeling depressed after her losses, and nothing picks a person up like beating ass, and Ume trying to weasel her way back into power. Again. The twins are essentially the same character, Tane playable by default in Power Instinct 1, with Ume being the boss, vice versa in Power Instinct 2, and both available in Legends with slightly different color palettes and moves. They each will throw their dentures at you, project giant yellow effigies of their scowling faces, and are incredibly spry for their age, however, making these sisters unmistakably cut from the same cloth. They also have the power to briefly transform into younger versions of themselves, which is just a fascinating idea that they managed to execute with aplomb. Let's move from 2 very Japanese characters in this very Japanese series to a real American. Keith Wayne. He ain't no Goketsuji who needs a surname when you can just have a second first name. Keith is from Chicago. He likes Rocky movies. He drinks raw eggs for breakfast. He smokes cigarettes and he steals beer. Gets in fights and pulls pranks. His dad's name is Johnny Wayne. He was in a gang until his dad asked him to stop, and he did, but he's still friends with the gang leader because he's so cool. He loves his dad and his dad loves him. He likes older women because of some unresolved trauma about his absentee mother. He throws lightning on the ground like Terry Bogard. He'll kick you into the sky like Colonel Guile. He's only in this tournament because he felt like it. And also there are hot girls there, and he loves his dad. America! Let's talk about the Chinese native Chinen, or as he's known in these early games, Thin Nen. He's a Buddhist monk who indulges in every vice you can think of, originally sent to the monastery by his mother to turn him into a good son, but that didn't happen. He in fact bailed on the monastery after stealing a bunch of money from the monks to fund his search for power, as in he went from temple to temple, learning as much as he could from each sect of monks, and adding it to his ultimate understanding of vague anime martial arts power. He's kind of like if Street Fighter's M. Bison used hard work and determination to become the psycho-crushing madman he is today. They even have a similar body shape. Except that somehow, despite being an absolute degenerate in practice, he still keeps a very calm Zen attitude. Is he a study in contrast and contradiction? A man lusting for power while keeping the teachings of Buddha in his heart? Or is he just faking it to mess with people while amassing a reputation for violence and indulgence? Chinen throws flaming skulls, and sometimes the whole skeleton, has unique-looking normals that take advantage of his long legs, and my personal favorite, a paralyzing attack that doesn't use freezing ice, but instead binding paper talismans. Not bad for a guy who looks like Krillin's dad. Annie Hamilton is a curious character that I think is kind of emblematic of the Power Instinct design ethos. Her visuals are a little bit boring, despite being inspired by the stylish all-female musical theater group Takarazuka Revue. She's a spoiled, wealthy native of London, but despite being bossy and domineering, she's very compassionate, which is a fun twist. Usually characters, especially in fighting games, are kind of one note, and for her to have this nuance makes her intriguing. Annie loves animals and has 6 dogs, 4 cats, 3 horses, and a tortoise named Kensington. She first discovered her powers as a child during her social dance lessons, which could quite possibly be a real thing. I don't know. I'm a poor. Annie was paired with one of the more nervous boys in the group who kept messing up, eventually stepping on her dress, tearing it, and knocking her down. Annie was so furious, glowing balls of energy manifested and destroyed the classroom. There were no casualties, but despite Annie's shame, she couldn't bring herself to apologize. She simply never returned to the class. Mood. This stubbornness also shows up with her Rainbow Barrier move, only used in the first Power Instinct because she saw Tane pull off something similar and had to rework the whole thing to retain its uniqueness. An odd thing to fixate on since the rest of her moves are so generic, but it's her aesthetic. I'm not gonna harsh it. Her moves visuals could be pretty cool, like when she shoots golden swans at people, and her Photon Schnauzer special adds more power to punches and fireball moves, but otherwise she's not the most unique fighter. Maybe that's a case if Seinfeld is unfunny, but here I am watching Seinfeld in 2023, and I've heard this joke enough times now that it's not clever anymore.
Hey, so what's the deal with brunch? I mean, if it's a combination of breakfast and lunch, how come there's no lupper? Or no linner?
After failing to become the head of the Goketsuji clan in the tournament from the first Power Instinct, Annie was walking Kensington in the park when she came across a fellow tortoise fancier walking his own noble beast. She began visiting the park more frequently, coyly trying to introduce herself to the man, and eventually they had their meet cute. They hit it off, and Annie finally earned the courage to ask him to give her his tortoise. The man refused, Annie's heart was broken, and that's the end of her story for now. One of these days, I'm going to be kidding, and you're going to believe it and look really silly when you tell all your friends what you learned from me. But today is not that day. Another deceptively bland-looking fighter, Reiji Oyama, the hot-blooded karate man from Yokohama, Japan, is one part Ryu from Street Fighter and one part Hoshi Hyuma from the 1960s baseball manga/anime Star of the Giants. He's sort of a parody of the badass wandering martial artist in the same way Keith Wayne is a parody of badass American street toughs. He has the Hadouken, the Shoryuken, and even does Ryu's throw and sweep, but there are differences, including Reiji possessing Chun-Li's lightning kick. Reiji loves karate and has become a master of every karate tournament he stepped into, inspiring him to join the no-holds-barred 16th Goketsuji tourney. When he fails to win, it really affects him. He steps up his game, becomes a 6th Dan black belt, and then begins a dramatic training regimen. See, Reiji is a construction worker when he's not destroying ankles, and one day when his quick reaction save a coworker from a falling spanner, he declares they should, at any moment, without warning, attack him to keep him on his toes. As time goes on, fewer and fewer of his friends show up to attack him, and eventually he believes he's driven everyone away, until they all jump him while he's sleeping in the night. Reiji is overjoyed and feels he's finally ready for the next tournament. Speaking of parodies, how do you justify a fully costumed ninja in a then-modern 1993 fighting game? Easy. Give him some trauma-induced fear of social interactions. Saizo Hattori was shy enough as a kid, but the night before a family reunion, a cousin scribbled an obscene word on his face. And when young Saizo emerged to greet his loved ones, they all pointed and laughed at him.
They're all gonna laugh at you!
Also, his parents were out of town on business and supposed to show up for the reunion, but never did. I'm not sure if they died or just bailed on him, but it was all too much for Saizo and he withdrew even more inside himself. He doesn't show his face anymore, often speaks in a language he made up, though the Goketsuji family and some animals can inherently understand it, and in general avoids others. Despite this, for some reason, he gets a job as a costume mascot at a theme park, which makes sense when you think, hey, I can work here and never show any ounce of my body to another human being, but also you're constantly around people who really want to hang out with you. This was made even worse when he discovered the park's group changing rooms. In a panic, Saizo tried to throw a smoke bomb and escape the awkwardness, but accidentally threw down a load of fire bombs instead and destroyed the park. This backstory is delightfully mundane for someone who is a literal smoke bomb throwing, wave dashing, super fast ninja. With his reach and speed, he's one of the most fun characters to play, and the classic ninja look is absolutely a part of it. Likely for that reason, many of his endings involve him beginning to get over his fears, only to meet some stimulus that restores the status quo. Gotta keep that iconic mask in the sequels, after all. I want to hang out with White Buffalo. He's a stereotypical Native American, inspired somewhat by the 1962 Chuck Connors vehicle Geronimo. Down-to-earth, responsible, and capable. He's reticent but not stoic. In fact, he's quite friendly and easygoing. He spends his time on the reservation minding livestock, assisting the chief, and managing saleable goods, but his true passion is collecting shiny knickknacks, especially metallic items, jewelry, and animal figures. I can really relate to this guy. I do my best to help others, I'm quiet but playful. I love animals and silly trinkets. Plus, I too can drop flaming elbows and shoot yellow energy from my hands. I also love a character with good reach, and White Buffalo's long legs give him plenty. Despite being such an important member of the Amii tribe and future chief, White Buffalo was actually a descendant of the GOKETSUJI clan, and for that reason he was invited to the tournament. Still, this he uses to support the Amii, donating the money earned from his fight broadcasts to his people. The last member of the original Power Instinct roster is the Italian-born Angela Belti, meant to parody the strongman fighting game character trope by making it a woman?
Where do you get off having tits?
To sell this joke, they initially gave her a male voice, but they played her a bit more seriously after the first game, thankfully. Angela is a character who really does deserve respect. She's a professional animal trainer for the circus, hence the whip, and in particular has developed a bond with a pair of lions named Pachi and Spike. She was apparently inspired by the professional wrestler Reggie Bennett, who... Oh my.
I want to give it all to you.
During a Russian tour, Angela caught the eye of a Japanese wrestler, and who could blame him, who was also on tour, and the two became a couple who seemed deeply in love. This is, perhaps, why so many of her moves are borrowed from pro wrestling techniques. The circus moved on and Angela moved on with them, but when she finally had occasion to return to her beau, he was no longer there. Assuming he went home to Japan, she pursued him only to find out from one of his friends that he didn't want to see her anymore because he was jealous of her incredible physique. And who could blame him? Me, I could blame him. You find a woman like that, you keep her. On to Power Instinct 2, which added 5 new characters. We briefly mentioned Kanji Kokuin before as part of their GOKETSUJI twin story. A martial arts practitioner from a young age, Kanji was determined to become the strongest man in Japan, and he did. The end. Okay, not quite, but that's about the long and short of it. His adventures in heroism and feats of strength drew the ear of Tane and Ume's mother, who arranged a marriage with the daughter that hadn't been tossed into the ocean. Kanji couldn't stand Ume and they divorced, but as he's a descendant of the GOKETSUJI clan, it earns him the right to compete in the emergency tournament of Power Instinct 2 and win the damn thing. You may be wondering how Kanji managed this, aside from wit, guile, and taking advantage of an exhausted Tane. That would be with loincloth whips, big farts, and turning into his true form, a frail old man. Devastating. Kanji also has a great-grandnephew in Kintaro Kokuin, or Kinta for short. I hate this character. Not only is he a child, and I am classically not a fan of children, but he's an obnoxious little brat who thinks he's a sexy, sculpted superhero. I know the trope, especially in anime, the overconfident kid who's an absolute bastard to adults, and when he starts to get his comeuppance, resorts to crocodile tears to get out of trouble. And all that's plenty of reason to hate him, but the most annoying part is, to better show off his quote-unquote physique, he only wears a giant bib, which means during certain animations his little wing-wang is exposed. I don't have a moral objection to this, because it's obviously played for laughs and not anything creepy, but it's in poor taste. Sure, it was the 90s, and characteristic of Japanese humor. Hell, The Simpsons movie pulled a similar gag in 2007. But I don't want to see it, and I'm not putting it on my YouTube channel, so I have to carefully choose footage and edit around the damn thing. I can find things I like about him, though, particularly his moveset. He's got some really unique normals, conjures a giant koi to ride, vomits up bears at people, and summons his giant bear friend Caesar to obliterate the enemy health bar in one hit. Plus, transforming into a Sentai-inspired avatar of his dead dog is pretty creative, but we'll get to that in a bit. Inspired by Lady Miyako from the film Akira, Oshima GOKETSUJI is the mother of Ume and Tane, whose name I've been avoiding this whole time because it's a lot of proper nouns to dump on your head at the beginning of a video. A shrine maiden and martial artist, she showed early promise as a magic tournament fighter person. While visiting a friend's antique shop, she spilled water on a magic map and it revealed the location of many untold treasures, which she accumulated to help solidify her family's riches and build their reputation. It was she who declared power over the clan should be contested in a tournament every 5 years, even though when Ume eventually beat her for the title, it brought her great shame. Now she's back, flinging her hair around like Sindel, or rather the other way around, since Sindel debuted in 1995's Mortal Kombat 3, and swinging her tiny little old lady fists like my grandma at a pro wrestling event. The Wikia also describes her as clairvoyant, which, given the events of the game, I do not think I believe. Oshima only appears playable in Power Instinct 2 and Legends, a trait she shares with Sahad Asran Ryuto. He's a stoic Lebanese noble, which is a cultural identity you don't see in fiction a lot. I appreciate that. He's also a true Renaissance man, raised to be a master of art, athleticism, and even magic. Much like Keith Wayne, Sahad has 3 first names. I'm gonna call him Sahad, the wiki calls him Ryuto, if you want to call him Asran, that'll even us all out. His reserved nature was galvanized when his 3 older sisters began to bully him, not unlike Cinderella's stepsisters. When this torment continued at school, he discovered the only way to control his phenomenal magic power was to rein in his emotions and remain calm. A distant relative of the Goketsuji clan, Sahad caught fight footage of the first Power Instincts tournament on TV, which feels like such a legitimate, realistic way to find out about the tourney instead of a mysterious invite or supernatural vision. I love it. And participated in the emergency tourney to prove himself to his sisters and explore his heritage. When Kanji organized his own grand prize tournament, Sahad only entered to get closer to Angela, and who can blame him?
Yeah, right on.
I wanted to like Sahad more, but his moves suffer from Power Instinct's greatest flaw, being kind of difficult to pull off. He throws a scimitar around,
curved swords,
and can even summon a genie to do a little dance that beats the shit out of you. But his normals are less than impressive, and much like Oshima, I can see why he never made it into future games. Sahad was actually invited to the Matra Melee tournament, a game we're not covering today, but he missed his flight, forgot some important luggage at home, really wasn't interested, and just didn't feel like putting in the effort. I think I love the characters of Power Instinct. You, not you. The final character added in Power Instinct 2 was Kurara Harano Koji. Here's a fun fact, she was voiced by Kotono Mitsuishi, the voice of Sailor Moon. Fitting, as she was inspired by that character and the protagonist of Creamy Mommy, which isn't what it sounds like. It's an anime about a 10-year-old girl who gains the power to transform into a 16-year-old girl, and you know what? I don't need to know. Nobody needs to know.
Sleep! In your sleep all is forgotten.
Clara, as she eventually came to be known, swings her magic wand around, beats things with a giant hammer space mallet, and turns you into a duck. She can also change into a roller skate wearing super-powered form, which treads uncomfortably into Creamy Mommy territory and is a separate character in Legends called Super Clara. I actually really like Super Clara. She's got spunk. I love the roller skates, being a big fan of the original Kitty Pryde outfit, and she's got very natural feeling moves. Plus, she shoots cool electricity projectiles. But then there's that butt hanging out, and that butt hasn't seen enough years to pass in front of my eyes. Regular Clara's backstory reads largely like a dating profile, which I am uncomfortable reading because she is 13. Suffice it to say, she's a pretty normal Japanese teen, albeit a bit self-absorbed. Her favorite animals are pigs and ducks, hence all the pigs and ducks. She's at that age where she's interested in boys, and she's hoping to be accepted into Tokyo University. Or, you know, become the leader of the Goketsuji clan, go to Egypt, fall in love, travel the world, and eat red bean pancakes in front of the Parthenon. Clara proved so popular, she ended up starring in her own spin-off called Purikura Daisakusen and featured as a guest fighter in Heaven's Gate. No, not that one. No, not that one. There we go. Hang on, that game isn't on my to-do list. I swear, if that's another entry in the Goketsuji series, I have to figure out how to wedge it. Oh, no, it's its own game. Score. We'll have to take a look at that sometime. Speaking of characters that can turn into weird, uncomfortable shit, Poochie. This is actually a transformation of Kintaro's that exists as its own character in a few games. See, before the tournament in Power Instinct 2, Kintaro's father got him a dog in hopes of helping him become less of a terrible naked shitlord. That didn't work, but the kid loved the dog. Unfortunately, despite going into a school for problem children and being a problem child himself, Kintaro thought it was a great idea to leave Poochie at the school alone for an extended period of time, and the other kids beat him to death. The dog's dying words to his beloved boy were waf wah, nuan nuan, which is dog for, hey, I'm not gonna die. I'm gonna turn into the most horrifyingly slutty fursuiter Kmart can offer and protect you from evil. Also, you can turn into me. Or we trade places or something. See, I'm not really you, but I can replace you in a fight. You know what? Just don't think about it too hard. Poochie's moves are fluid, feel impactful, and are definitely what I would expect from this character. He digs up bones at you, slaps you with his extendo ears, his fursuit holds you down while he clubs your ass, and in spite of it all, I kinda love him. I mean, this is terrible. He just looks so off-putting, but there's something about him that's got charm. He's exactly the kind of superhero protector a kid whose dog died tragically would think up, and then Sinbad's non-existent rapping genie granted him a wish to make the superhero real, and now we're stuck with this. I don't hate it. Still better than Kintaro himself. I also don't hate that we can play as a Kuroko in Legends. That's the little ninja guys in the background of the other games. They're the extremely loyal personal assistants of the Goketsuji family, somewhere between a major domo and an Oompa Loompa. They don't really talk, they follow orders, and they all run around doing tasks most of the time. Kenji demanded one be present to act as a partner for fighters who couldn't otherwise come up with one, since the Legends tournament is sort of a tag team affair. You can't play them as the leader, so they have no ending and don't even possess much of a personality, but I love how they fight. They use fans, extendo boxing gloves, and a bunch of other knickknacks, and they are fast. Their super involves them shooting another Kuroko out of a cannon at the enemy. That's just great. Interestingly, in the US version of Legends, he's referred to as Ninja Boy and has this official art instead of, you know, this. Finally, we have the boss of Power Instinct Legends, Chuck. He was hired by Kanji to serve as the last challenge to win his Just for Fun tournament. He has no relation to the clan, is only playable via cheat codes, and only makes an appearance in Legends, so unlike everyone else in the cast, there's not a lot of info on him. He's a Brazilian Taekwondo fighter based on sports instructor Chuck Wilson and is described as narcissistic and overconfident. It's a shame this is his only outing because I love his flipping hurricane kick, his laser fireballs, and most of his normals. His big codpiece though? Yeah, I love that too. Your fave could never. Unless your fave is Voldo from Soul Calibur, then yeah, that's like his whole deal. And that's it. That's all I'm contractually obligated to say about Power Instinct until at least next season. The real trip about this game is, and I don't know if you can tell this from the footage, but it's good? It manages to stand out from Street Fighter while being cut from the same cloth, and plays around with concepts that weren't solidified yet, like tag team fighting and the super meter. I honestly wouldn't be surprised to see a revival at some point in the future. Atlus is obviously still making games, and they even make reference to this series in Persona 5 Royal. I love how the characters are this delightful mix of borderline offensive 90s humor and suspiciously on brand for the modern world. This is a game that features strong, confident women, underdressed himbos, and extremely relatable character motivations and reactions. And half this roster reads as some kind of neurodivergent or another. Like, most of them would see one of those, either these living with autism posts need to stop sounding so relatable or I need to go to therapy memes and have the reaction of, oh snap. If I have to level a criticism, I suppose it's that the in-game endings aren't great, hence why I haven't really mentioned anything about them. They're one-note jokes that have nothing to do with the overall story. But then, that's the tone for these games. It's hard to be critical of something that's so obviously getting the reaction it's looking for. My YouTube metrics suggest that if you found this channel, it was likely one of two ways: the Let's Play series on Journey of Wrestling, or the original Violent Profiles video on Bloodstorm. That microdosed acid trip of a game lacked coverage until Matt McMuscles decided to rank it among the worst fighting games of all time back in 2022. The amount of traffic and engagement it brought my humble channel even years after its arrival in cyberspace is what inspired me to finally return to this series in the first place. So you wouldn't be watching this video without Bloodstorm, and Bloodstorm wouldn't exist without the subject of this video. See, in 1992 there was a different weapons-based limb-lopping kill-tastic fighting game developed by Incredible Technologies that draws fighters from various points in time.
Time killing.
I'm Eric J. Chucky, and welcome to Violent Profiles, where we discuss obscure fighting games and the rosters that define them. I first encountered time killers at the front of our local Value City. Or maybe it was Odd Lots. The logo was definitely orange. Either way, I wasn't interested in shopping there, but my mom and aunt were, so I was given a few quarters to keep me busy, and time killers was the option I chose. See, back in ancient times before smartphones, sometimes stores, restaurants, bars, and other businesses would have a few cabinets to pass the time with. It was amazing. Customers were encouraged to linger and buy more. Small change had a purpose. You could hear Pac-Man noises everywhere. If they had known what I was playing, they would not have been cool with that. I was like 8. They gave me a disapproving look when I played the Simpsons arcade game. I can't imagine the flack I would have gotten for this decapitation simulator. I also spent some time with the Genesis port, renting it at some point after it was released 4 years later, but we're going to be talking about the arcade game today because, well, look at the alternative. The story is barely more than a summary in the manual itself. Warriors throughout history have been unknowingly frustrating the villainous embodiment of Death by defeating his dark agents. Tired of their nonsense, Death has claimed each of them and is forcing them to battle one another. The victor has the honor of facing Death in single combat, and if they win, they gain immortality. As simple a plot as it still manages to make zero sense under scrutiny. You'll see. What causes Time Killers to stand out from its underwhelming combat and somewhat bland characters the manual describes as eternal combatants is the unique feature of being able to kill your opponent at any time during the match. You can also choose to cut off one or both of their arms, rendering them unable to use those limbs in combat, which is pretty neat and would probably appeal to Bart Simpson. Whoa! Let's start with Rancid, a series of tropes I wish we'd seen more versions of in the FGC. This absolute icon of Gen X pastiche has a backstory befitting the Crow and wields a frickin' chainsaw. He hails from New Chicago, and we have but a few short months before his timeline arrives. I don't know about you, but I've been waiting for our society to descend into Streets of Fire rules since I was a kid, so I'm glad we don't have to wait much longer. Rancid was abandoned in the decaying Undercity around the turn of the new millennium, forced to fend for himself and not beholden to the corrupt morality of the social elite. This led Rancid to be a Casey Jones-like figure.
You want a fist in the mouth?
Mysterious vigilante playing by his own rules and doing what he thought was right as opposed to what was accepted behavior by those in power.
Wait, is that what you think?
The nail that sticks out gets hammered down, of course, and a series of grisly murders are pinned on Rancid, turning the city he loves against him. In a mad race against time, being pursued by both the police and the underground that raised him, Rancid tracks down the real killer, a mysterious figure named Plague who carves an X in the head of each of his victims. Rancid nearly becomes one himself before he uses a chainsaw to slaughter the murderer and promptly disappears into Death's clutches. This brings us to our first narrative anomaly, a plot hole, if you will. Death's motivation to send evil goons here is to thwart an opposing entity known as Life. Very creative, I know, they didn't ask much of us back in the 90s. You'll see a lot of these themes in every backstory, morbid characters and inky black sludge monsters assailing our heroes throughout history. Here's the thing, if Death can zorp you into this tournament of the afterlife without you being dead, why doesn't he just do this before the hero is victorious over his minions? The endings don't even really capitalize on this, and usually it would have been more interesting if they did. Rancid's ending is just him revving his chainsaw in victory. Let's say he instead did fall to Death's artisanal serial killer, thus taking out one of Life's champions. His ending could have instead seen him return to max health and chop up Plague with a chainsaw, clearing his own name and fighting as an icon of the people of New Chicago forevermore. In fact, here's a quick overall rewrite for you so I don't keep repeating myself. We keep the Life versus Death thing, but Death snaps since Life keeps effortlessly defeating him with champions who aren't even aware of the significance. So Death goes back through time when he was closest to victory and nabs each of the warriors, forcing them to fight in the tournament to see who will gain immortality. Only there's a plan B. Once victorious, Death offers the warrior to serve under him, otherwise they'll have to fight him as their final opponent. Your chosen hero would tell Death to kick rocks, get a little bit more pathos, and theoretically have a better ending. Anyway, let's jump to Lord Wolf, who I'm honestly not sure why they didn't just call King Arthur. He hails from Camelot, wields Excalibur, looks the part. Arthur's even got an antagonist named Mordred, which would keep with the theming of Death's subordinates. But no, instead we have Count Morbid, the tyrannical ruler of Spinstershire. Wolf at some point leaves Camelot for this terribly named locale, and soon after has his wife and children kidnapped by the nefarious Count. Naturally, this leads him to start a revolution, culminating in a midnight battle during a thunderstorm. Lightning strikes Wolf's sword and is redirected into Morbid, bringing peace to the town as the storm subsides. But Arthur, wow, I literally typed that out of reflex, holy hell. Wolf has disappeared to be forced into Death's idiot tournament. It's a stretch to say that anyone in this game has a fighting style. They mostly just make long, awkward punches and kicks or bop you with their weapon of choice. However, I do have to question making so many of a character like the sword-wielding Wolf's moves things like super kicks and uppercuts instead of using, you know, the sword. If you're going to make a weapon battler, let them use their weapons. Criminy, he's not a young book. He can at least shoot lightning, though the button combo to get him to do that is kinda weird. You have to hold back and the head button to have him taunt, but before he actually screams, Excalibur, you hit forward and he does a glitchy looking thrust, and one sperm of electricity fires off. Why aren't more of his moves using the sweet electrified version of his sword? I feel like cutting a guy with a lightning sword would be a hell of a lot more impactful than this. If Arthur Wolf is successful in defeating Death, he's crowned as King of Spinstershire. Hooray. At least he unambiguously has returned to his own time, unlike our next fighter, Musashi. He might be based off a real person, the legendary Kensei Miyamoto Musashi, but his backstory is a weird bastardization to the tale of the Yofune Nushi, a sea serpent who demanded virgin sacrifices until one young woman outsmarted and defeated the dragon. The Time Killer's Musashi led an army of invincible samurai, never having lost in battle or even suffered a single casualty until he ran afoul of the fire-breathing Yofune Nushi, who destroyed literally his entire army. Musashi bravely ran away, spent years getting folked, and finally returned to vanquish the dragon, but neither emerged from their epic confrontation within its lair. Maybe if the army had done more front-flip dropkicks to the dragon, they wouldn't have been baked alive in their armor. Most of Musashi's arsenal consists of using his two blades, a fighting trait of the real Miyamoto Musashi, to attack anything 5 inches in front of his chest. He gets a pretty sweet wall jump, which initially made me feel like he'd be a pretty viable combatant, but his insistence on only using his swords against enemies that are already hugging him complicated that. If you beat the game with Musashi, his honorable spirit lives on in harmony with his people. So I guess Death decided not to grant him immortality after all? I'm sure everyone in the arcade was glad to have dropped $20 worth of quarters on that. Let's move on to Matrix, who isn't from the past but the future, both in terms of her in-game origins and the stuff she predates. The Matrix movie wouldn't come out for another 7 years, but here's our girl fighting an oppressive robotic regime nonetheless. She hails from a world after the colonization of space in the year 3297. In fact, her bio opens with, Matrix was 4 years old when the cyber wars began on Mars, her home planet. The short version is a rogue AI sent by Death called the Master Drone reprogrammed all the servitor robots and started an uprising. Matrix joined the fight when she came of age and even accepted a replacement cybernetic arm when her biological one was lost in the conflict. It was this arm that gave her the edge over the Master Drone, and despite Death's agent attacking her on both, quote, physical and binary levels, Matrix sliced it to bits with her photon blade and crushed its living heart with her bionic hand. Having chosen the red ending, all machines fell lifeless across Mars, but Matrix herself was lost to death. Between her extendo fist and lightsaber, Matrix has pretty decent reach, but like the rest of the roster, her moves are underwhelming. I dig her Sonya Blade by way of Tron aesthetic, but it's fighting against a pretty heavy albatross of, being in Time Killers. If you beat the game, you're informed she led her troops to victory against alien Hordes, preserving the future of humanity, which isn't at all her backstory. At least they built a statue in her honor, I guess. Better than putting her name on a wall. Who's next? Leif? The game calls him Life, which is amusing to me. I guess some parts of the Netherlands pronounce it that way, but they seem to be in the vast minority. Most say Leif, or Leif. Perhaps it's meant to be a play on the warriors in this game supposedly working for an entity called Life, but that might be giving the designers too much credit given the rest of the story. I assume inspired by Leif Erikson, this Viking opposed the Black Army, led by the mysterious Black Thorn. No matter how many ships he smashed and armies he conquered, Leif couldn't find the leader of his greatest antagonists. So he conjured up a brilliant plan to get himself captured and brought to Black Thorn's lair of the unknown. They tortured him, battered him, and weakened him to the point of near uselessness so that once he was brought before Black Thorn, he could be effortlessly executed. But a true Viking always holds on to something, and Leif used his last remaining ounce of adrenaline to catch Black Thorn off guard and, quote, send him into eternal darkness. This is a game about cutting people's arms off. You can just say he killed him. For my money, Leif is the worst character on the roster. Short reach, clumsy specials, if you can call them that, a lack of power behind his blows, constantly screams, Odin! I wasn't personally impressed. Neither is death, apparently, as when you beat the game, Leif is another soul not granted immortality. Instead, the Norse gods are the ones to reward Leif, granting him his greatest wish to forever sail the seven seas, glowing brightly during any and all day-for-night shots he may be party to. Back to the future with Orion from 2885 AD, he has the Luke Skywalker urge to escape his measly backwater space station home and explore the deepest reaches of the galaxy. Unlike Luke Skywalker, Orion just goes to school and gets his pilot's license, immediately commandeering an experimental dimensional slide craft. Upon returning from his jaunt, he finds his home overrun by Clintar-looking abominations. But when he reports this to the proper authorities, they arrest him, thinking him responsible. Somehow. That sounds stupid, but given the last few years of police ineptitude, I'm not as incredulous as I might have been in the past. Orion escapes and gets in the ship, scouring space for the real culprit. Hang on, for a second there I thought this was meant to be a parody of the O.J. Simpson trial, but that wasn't until 1995. Did the makers of this game actually have some kind of time travel at their disposal, and only used it to make second-rate knockoffs of stuff that hadn't happened yet? Anyhow, Orion can't find the goo monster, so he just sort of becomes a legendary space outlaw, collecting treasure and kicking ass. He gets a tip about where the shadow creatures might come from, heads off, and finds his way into the tournament, which makes his abduction the one-time death stop to consider, hang on, maybe I should just kidnap them before they kill my greatest soldiers. Orion moves bizarrely, looks like an aged-up Harlan band from Space Cases, and fights with an electro saber, which is just a big dagger with the edges painted teal. My favorite parts about him are, win or lose, he floats up into the sky after the match is over, and if you beat the game with him, he just goes back to wandering around space. No follow-up on his search for the goo fiends, no specific destination, just off he goes in search of generic prey. You know, the more I think about it, Orion might be the protagonist of, like, Starfield. He had a goal with a lot of motivation, but then got distracted collecting all the secret trophies instead of completing it. Sounds like the player character in a Bethesda game to me. On the other end of the spectrum, we have Mantaz, or more specifically, the Queen of the Mantaz. She's the only playable character who is explicitly evil, at least in the sense that her goal is to wipe out the human race and inhabit Earth in their stead. Mantaz is from the year 4002, long after Orion and even Matrix's times, and with as capable and durable as her people are, they seem poised to succeed in annihilating humanity. Then the Queen disappears, and like freshman college students, the rest of the Mantaz don't know what to do without their mom, so eventually they just integrate with human society. The manual speculates that Mantaz is the only fighter Death Zorped not for being an agent of life who thwarted his plans, but for having the audacity to almost accomplish what he failed to do. Beat the game with her, and it implies she does exactly that, brooding over a new batch of eggs in triumph on a planet that belongs to her people. Mantaz is by far the most unique fighter in the game, attacking with spinning blade arms, an extendo head, eye lasers, and even possessing the option to fly short distances. She's also a 7-foot-tall mantis alien, which in case you didn't know is not a common trope in most video games. This doesn't make her the best fighter, however. To award that honor, we need to go to the past. 20,000 BC, in the aftermath of the war between the cavemen and the lizard-like alien creatures known as troglodytes, Thug stands triumphant. At his feet is the Supreme One, leader of the troglodytes, and it looks like he'll be leading humanity into a new era of prosperity when... Zorp? Don't get me wrong, Thug is ugly. He's the worst looking character in this game, and that's saying something. I distinctly remember Time Killers being less hideous, but maybe that was my impressionable juvenile mind not grasping exactly what made good art and what clearly didn't. Or maybe I just didn't fight Thug much back then. His very large body only throws more into relief how terrible the art and shading are. It reminds me of that phase a lot of artists go through while learning to color art digitally, myself included, where they pillow shade every drawing with mushy colors and garish textures. Some of these clips are similar to the art style I'm talking about. Too much highlight using uniform colors for both it and the shading, and even still, this looks a lot better. I don't have any of my drawings from back then, and I'm not picking on some poor teenage deviant artist, so the Real Adventures of Johnny Quest intro will have to do. If you watched high-action animation from the late 90s/early aughts, you've seen what I'm referring to from artists with much better training than the folks who put together Time Killers. Most of us grew out of that. Thug is forever trapped rendered in this terrible art style. Thug also doesn't have very good special moves, but what he does have is decent power, decent reach, and few opportunities to punish. I made it a whole 3 rounds into the ladder with Thug, better than I managed with any other character. If you're better at Time Killers than me, and if so, why, you might make it all the way to the end with him, defeating death to return home and accidentally create fire, jump-starting humanity's technological advancement. Okay, well there's actually some debate about humans discovering fire way earlier, but much like Vikings not wearing horned helmets and samurai not being in the business of front flip dropkicks, we didn't know that back in the 90s. Finally, we come to the boss of the game, Death. What the hell is that? Oh my god, he looks like, well, I don't even have a joke. This is terrible character design. Rob Liefeld wouldn't tell you this looks cool. Why is he dressed like Kmart Thanos? What's going on with his weird feet? Why is his hair made out of spicy Cheetos? Look, around the same time, I also introduced Death as a villain for my original character superhero, inspired by the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse appearing in the Archie Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles series around when Time Killers made its arcade debut. However, much like the TMNT, I had the decency to make him a skeleton in a robe. And need I remind you that I was like 7 or 8? This is terrible design. This is a rejected minor He-Man villain. This should not be the final boss of your game, even if the rest of your character designs look like this. Whatever. Time Killers as a concept had potential, but unfortunately it was executed upon with the clumsy earnestness of easily distracted preteens. Imagine if the roster were doubled, Death forcing the heroes to battle his minions again on his terms. Seeing figures like Blackthorn and Count Morbid could add to their presence and give us edgy 90s kids badass evil figures to root for. Could you imagine playing an Icarus Black Blob monster before BlazBlue's Arakune or even Marvel vs. Capcom's Venom? Could you imagine? It probably wouldn't have even been that good anyhow. Instead of Time Killer's spiritual successor taking the game's good concepts and improving on them, they seem to cherry pick everything that didn't work. Like the clumsy character design, stiff movements, and bad storytelling, and jammed it all into Bloodstorm with a little extra shock poured on top for good measure. Both of Incredible Technology's fighting entries had a lot of potential and even more ambition, but I'm a little more forgiving of Bloodstorm because it managed to be its own thing, whereas Time Killers got shown up in every way just a year later with Eternal Champions. So similar are these two games, in fact, that I have to wonder if Time Killers was a secret inspiration for Eternal Champions, or perhaps it even spurred the creators to make a better game in the same vein out of spite, just to prove it could be done. Some of the parallels between the two are oddly specific. This game is basically the reason I started this series, both in the metaphorical sense and the literal one. I played a lot of fighting games when I was a kid, and I also rented a lot of games. At least every other weekend since about 1995 was filled with 3 days of me blissfully blasting through a new title. Whether that was a licensed platformer, an in-depth RPG, an ant simulator, or as it often was, a fighting game like MACE the Dark Age. I'm Eric J. Chucky, and welcome to Violent Profiles, where we discuss obscure fighting games and the rosters that define them. You might be wondering why, if MACE is so important to me, I didn't make it more of a priority to cover. Why wasn't it the first episode of this season? Why wasn't it part of the initial series of videos I put out years ago? The short answer is incentive. I wanted to make good on the hype I built, reward the patience of longtime viewers, and actually put out a year's worth of content I could be proud of. If MACE was always looming on the horizon as a goalpost, I was more likely to get there. And here we are. I don't believe I ever owned the MACE cart in my youth, though I do possess a copy today, but I probably spent enough money borrowing it back then that I should have just made the purchase. Atari and Midway's 1997 release lured me in with Nintendo Power previews featuring a scary headsman and a lava warlord. Despite the reviews that called it a Mortal Kombat ripoff that looks fantastic but plays poorly, damning it with the faint praise of being, ironically, one of the best fighters on the system to date in a pool of good fighting games available for the N64 that was quite shallow, this remains one of my all-time favorite fighters. A large part of that is the characters and ideas that have sprinkled themselves through my own works in time since, be they Dungeons & Dragons campaigns, E-Fed personalities, my Soul Calibur Create a Soul roster, or a little video series on the internet. MACE the Dark Age is rad, and I'd like to tell you why. We open in the 14th century. Asia is at constant war, beset by Batu Khan's Golden Horde. The Middle East is run by a shadow organization of assassins who set up and eliminate political pawns to maintain power, and Europe is ground under the thumb of a handful of despotic feudal lords. The biggest players among them all are the Covenant of Seven, who have thrown their lot in with Asmodeus, who is listed as a practitioner of the dark arts in the intro, but, I mean, that's clearly a friggin' demon. Look at him. Asmodeus wields the Mace of Tanis, an artifact imbued with necropotic energy that offers those who command it everlasting life and ultimate power at the price of forcing them to feed off of despair, disease, and poverty. That's fine with Asmodeus, he just shares a bit of the Mace's power with the Covenant of Seven in exchange for their continued tyranny, ensuring he'll be able to sustain his might. Of course, wicked hearts like the Seven are rarely content with what they're given, so each begins conspiring to take Asmodeus' magic beatstick for their own. They dispatch their mightiest warriors in pursuit of it, and some even aim to claim it by their own hands. We join the story shortly after this point, in the midst of a civilian uprising as diverse powers converge en route to the Mace itself. Let's begin with the big bad voodoo daddy, Lord Deimos. The most prominent playable antagonist in the game, I commend Mace for slapping him on the box art. Most titles wouldn't put such a despicable character in the story solo on the cover until the Far Cry series made it cool in 2012. Unless you count Bubsy 3D.
What could possibly go wrong?
This Bavarian autocrat is a long-standing member of the Covenant of Seven, ruling from his mountaintop fortress overlooking a vast, tortured landscape known as the Great Wastelands. It's all very Volcano Manor, if I'm being honest. If he turned into a giant communism snake, I'd have some questions for FromSoft. Deimos has persisted for hundreds of years and wears armor forged by the devil himself. It's Deimos and his agents responsible for riling up the rest of the Seven, hastening their infighting so that he may take advantage. His aims are to have Countess Taria by his side, Asmodeus' gruesome head on his wall, and the Mace of Tanis in his iron fist. If your efforts at battling the latter of opponents are unsuccessful, Deimos returns to Bavaria to find not delicious conciliatory cream-filled donuts, but his fortress in the hands of the peasant populace whose lives he made a literal living hell. Weakened from the battle and just as susceptible to action economy as the rest of us, the peasants overtake him and nearly lash him in chains. Not wanting to take the L to a bunch of rabble, Deimos breaks free long enough to hop into the lava moat surrounding his castle, cooking himself to ash inside his own armor.
Toasty!
But Deimos is a 7-foot-tall fire wizard wielding a molten greatsword, so he's very likely to be successful against Asmodeus. In this scenario, he drinks the devil's blood and uses the mace to kill the remaining Covenant of Seven, adding their legions to his own and uniting Eurasia under his rule. The Second Dark Age lasts eternally, and no one can threaten the power of the malfeasant Lord Deimos. Mace isn't all about the bad guys, though. Here's Mordos Call, the first guy you fight in arcade mode and owner of a bitchin' stage song. An Italian orphan raised by the Romani, Call's life takes a miserable turn one November when the people who gave him a home for his formative years are outlawed by one of the Seven and slaughtered wholesale. Call fought back, and his skill was noticed by the mercenaries who were sent to do the deed, along with the fact that he wasn't actually Romani himself. The mercs offered him a place in their company, and ever since, Mordos Call's flail has been for sale to the highest bidder. He's a veteran of countless wars and the last surviving member of the outfit, with everyone else having met a tragic, accidental end. This impressive pedigree earned the eye of one of the Covenant of Seven, who has hired him to retrieve the Mace of Tanis. If Call swings and kicks his way to victory, he learns two important details from the mace, the names of his greatest enemies. Sir Dragon was the member of the Seven who had his parents killed, and Lord Deimos gave the order to annihilate his second Romani family. Mordos Call resolves to infiltrate the ranks of the Seven, continue to earn their trust as a powerful mercenary, and eventually destroys them from the inside. His honorable soul has turned the mace into a weapon of virtue, wielding it with wisdom and inspiring the masses for generations to come. Or, more likely, since the other dozen members of the roster defeat him in the first steps toward Asmodeus, Call returns to Italy a shattered man. He intends to join the farmers and put his physique to good use, but with the soil tainted and ruined by the evil power of the mace, they cannot support him. Call becomes a shell of his former self, begging for money and food as he staggers through the streets. Our next fighter is Al-Rashid.
Of the turbulent wind.
No, not you, get out of here. The son of Khalid, king of the assassins, Al-Rashid was eager to impress his father and join the League. Tasked with eliminating the potentate of Damascus, Al-Rashid went above and beyond not only by killing him, but his advisors and 14 personal bodyguards without making enough noise to wake the guard dogs. Damn, where's my stealth action Al-Rashid game? Because of his exemplary success, Khalid gifted his son a pair of legendary scimitars forged with the power of the
turbulent wind.
Yes, that. This is what grants Al-Rashid tornado magic in addition to his sick-ass whirling dervish offense. Rashid is dispatched to retrieve the Mace of Tanis on contract from the Sultan of Chicagoland, but what possible hope could a simple assassin with magic wind swords have against a towering demon? Al-Rashid is so thoroughly beaten that he loses his signature weapons. His father is understandably pissed off and tells him to get the swords back, but Al-Rashid remembers having to fight an actual demon and tries to kill Khalid instead. Turns out the king of the assassins is pretty good at hand-to-hand combat and bests his son, imprisoning him in the tallest tower of his fortress to never again see the light of day. But if Al-Rashid were able to claim the mace for himself, he could use its power to kill his father with ease. He could, in fact, then become the king of the assassins, usurp the Sultan of F.R.E.A.K., and hypnotize Namira to become his personal concubine. His people would hate him and constantly make attempts on his life, but you can't out-assassinate the new king of the assassins. I actually like the idea of him losing more, because in a theoretical non-existent sequel to the game, Al-Rashid could have broken out from his prison, or be unleashed by Khalid and become this ravenous, frenzy-driven madman obsessively searching for his lost swords. Also, shout out to all my pedantic homies in the audience who are currently really pleased that a so-called assassin in a video game is actually primarily performing murders of prominent political figures. I mentioned Namira back there, so let's explore her story next. Namira's birth name is Tulwara, and she's an Arabian princess whose family was murdered by Khalid and the Sultan of F.R.E.A.K. Namira's life was spared since she was smuggled out of the castle by one of her guards, but instead of being granted freedom or help to find justice for her family's assassination, she was instead sold into slavery for retirement money. Since, you know, that whole make sure the royal family doesn't get murked gig didn't quite work out for him. Namira ends up a dancing girl in a lesser sultan's harem. She has no memory of her childhood, but there are dreams that seem so real they might be memories of a palatial estate and a pampered life. She overhears servants talking about the missing Princess Tulwara and begins to wonder. Either way, she's fed up with wiggling for perverts and learns swordplay from a court eunuch to kill the Sultan. She questions him about her origins, but with his dying breath he spits only "Asmodeus knows," which is a baller way to say screw you to your murderer. Oh, you stabbed me through the heart and now you want to know about your secret origins? How about go ask the Super Devil? If that goes how the dying Sultan planned, Namira is handed over to the Sultan of F.R.E.A.K., member of the Covenant of Seven and the guy who footed the bill for her family's execution. She's physically and psychologically abused, becoming delirious and eventually trying to convince the castle rats of her royal birthright. Tragic. But her good ending leads me to question how honorable Namira's goals truly are. If she uses her fiery spirit and the little bit of magic she commands to defeat Asmodeus, she learns about all parties responsible for her family's murder and cuts her way through the ranks, going the extra mile to kill Khalid's son Al-Rashid and taking particular pleasure in it. Which, pretty sure we killed him on the way in, but, you know what, never mind. Namira becomes the first Sultana, which, whether Atari knew this or not, is historically accurate, as the real-life first female Sultan Khadija wasn't until 1347. She reverses the gender roles and forces men to veil their faces and surrender their businesses, and the ripples of this are felt all the way into modern times, where her empire is known to produce some of the most powerful and skilled businesswomen and politicians. I actually really like this ending because it provides subtle commentary on the nature of revenge and how often characters driven by it can take things too far, even when their motives seem pure. Is Namira justified in killing the people responsible for ruining her life and reversing the restrictive rules against women? Sure. But in enforcing the same rules on men and killing Al-Rashid, again, simply for the pleasure of it, just makes her a different kind of tyrant. But the game doesn't hold your hand to get to this point, or even go out of its way to say, see, she's just as bad. It lets you draw your own conclusions. It's more nuanced than you'd expect from the ending to a 90s decapitation simulator. On a less highbrow note, I always liked how her pants are actually semi-transparent, probably a simple effect to achieve even back then, but I didn't see it a lot and I thought it really helped sell her fantasy. Koyasha is a young master of ninjutsu, already having reached peak skill in hundreds of traceless killing techniques. But she doesn't kill for money or out of some solemn duty, she does it for love of the game. As such, when she finds out about her opposite number, Al-Rashid, Koyasha decides this would be a worthy test of her skills and makes him one of her next targets. The other is the mysterious influence behind the corrupt power that's only just now reaching Japan's shores, Asmodeus himself. She fights how you'd expect, dual-wielding wakizashi and throwing shuriken, although there seems to be an electric aspect to some of her abilities. Maybe she trained at the same dojo as Kennen. Should she be unsuccessful in her campaign, Koyasha is scolded by her sensei for going off half-cocked trying to defeat the greatest evil the world has ever known, all by herself. He busts her back down to sergeant so fast it makes her head spin, and she's forced to sweep the floors and do the laundry for the entire clan. Koyasha fails at defeating a literal demon, and as punishment she gets grounded with extra chores. Hilarious. She even manages to eventually prove she's legitimately the greatest ninja in the world, but by the time she does, Asmodeus and the Covenant have already ruined everything, so what's the point? It turns out Koyasha prefers self-made rulers, whether they're benevolent or despotic. Should she find victory and claim the mace for herself, she just kind of ditches it and builds a monastery in the mountains of her home country in search of spiritual perfection. In her personal philosophy, the ebb and flow of power should be managed by what humanity can achieve on its own, not through a magical MacGuffin. To her, the mace is nothing more than a trophy, symbolizing her status as the greatest ninja of all time. A dude so cool he's known only by his job title, the Executioner is a torture artist who thrives off pain and misery. Exactly the kind of monster the Mace of Tanis would feel at home with. The executioners made his bones, plying his trade to the Covenant of Seven, keeping their prisoners and cast-offs in his island fortress of Alcatraz.
I see what you did there.
He's a hobbyist at heart, enjoying experimental new tortures and collecting noteworthy implements with which to cause harm. His axe, for example, was said to have been used to kill crusaders in Jerusalem. He even likes to have a little bit of fun with his prisoners and starts every day by releasing one onto his island. If they can find a way off, they're granted their freedom. If he catches them, he'll enact particularly brutal torture against them, such as flaying them alive. Most of the released prisoners opt to just become shark food, and no one has ever escaped. X sees the recent infighting amongst the Covenant as an opportunity to seize power, so he grabs his axe and his best throw-in heads and leaves in search of Asmodeus. If I can criticize, however, Executioner suffers from the same big guy with an axe problem a lot of characters in fighting games have, in that he seems to use unwieldy swings and poke people with the butt of his weapon more than, you know, the choppy part. Even still, he's good at his job, and once Asmodeus is vanquished, the world enters a new age of torment, where every man, woman, and child is subjected to the senseless violence at the Executioner's depraved whims. If he instead fails, X goes back home only to find Asmodeus there waiting for him. He admires the Executioner's collection, compliments his work, and then conjures up a Grand Inquisitor from the Crusades to give him a few pointers. The torturer becomes the tortured, as X is confined to his own hellish prison at the hands of cruel creativity for the rest of time. Ragnar Bloodaxe of the Torsgard Bloodaxes is a Viking prince whose family and village were mooned by Lord Demos. Wait, what? Man, I'm not exactly an expert on etymology or anything, but I don't think that means what you think it means. The idyllic winter paradise of Torsgard found itself beset by ominous black wolves with glowing red eyes that began attacking the smaller villages. Ragnar and his men followed a rumor that the wolves were coming from an eastern forest, but halfway into the journey had a premonition that it was all a ruse, that crimson-clad men were slaughtering his loved ones, so he turned back. Unfortunately, it was too late. Ragnar's family lay maimed amidst the snow, his legacy in ruin. From the tree line, the wolves watched, silently mocking him. The berserker gong descended upon Ragnar, and he vowed to find the man responsible and make him pay. The likeliest culprit? Crimson-clad Lord Demos himself. Ragnar uses twin axes, historically inaccurate helmet horns, and Shoryuken-like uppercuts to carve his way on a bloody path to Demos and Asmodeus after him. He uses the power of the mace to restore Torsgard and make it the most beautiful city in the north. He remarries, fathers many beautiful children, and peace and prosperity stand as a monument to his fallen family. Ever the warrior king, Ragnar remains vigilant in the event that evil once again rears its ugly head. If you're not so successful, Asmodeus curses Mr. Bloodaxe for his insolence, transforming him into a ravenous black wolf himself. Ragnar can only watch in horror, his sapient mind trapped in a body that knows only violence as it devours the very people he was trying to save. While some folks want peace, others only desire power. Countess Taria is the daughter of the Duke Malinoche of Iberia, one of the Covenant of Seven. Taria was born under a black moon and prophesied to be the downfall of Asmodeus, so understandably it was demanded of the Duke he hand over his offspring. But instead of Taria, he sacrificed her twin brother Taurus. More on him in a bit. I like this backstory because it screams hero origin, but the Countess is most definitely not a hero. Naturally inclined toward the dark arts, she has become an unrivaled sorceress and traversed many demonic realms in a bid for strength. The only thing that could offer her more is the Mace of Tanis, and so it shall be hers. Taria wields a broadsword and dagger supplemented by the aforementioned dark magic. More on that later. Even if she fails, Asmodeus is rather taken with her and makes her his bride. Not quite the power couple you might expect, the Countess resents not being the one in charge and comes up with new schemes and spells to attempt to wrest the mace from his grasp. Eventually, Asmodeus gets tired of this and banishes her to a barren plain where her soul withers for want of anything to conquer and kill. Very 90s villainess, evil for evil's sake and reveling in it until she's served with an ironic punishment. Pelt Asmodeus with enough magic missiles, however, and the Countess takes hold of the mace, absorbing the generations of suffering it's caused and unleashing its power to become a demon herself. She leaves her father to rule Earth in her stead, foraying into all 99 layers of hell and fighting archdemon after archdemon to become queen of the Netherworld. Our second to last of the main cast, Zhao Long is a blind, staff-wielding monk. The son of a Chinese warlord who was vassal to Batu Khan, Zhao Long's training began in his youth across the Mongolian steppes. In his mid-teens and climbing the ranks of the young soldiers, he was given the opportunity to publicly behead an enemy soldier in the glorious traditions of the Khan. However, while Zhao Long felt comfortable fighting, he didn't like the idea of killing in cold blood. His mercy was rewarded with exile, but not before the Khan burned out Zhao Long's eyes. Fortunately, Zhao Long was found by a group of Shaolin monks and they took him in, teaching him their ways as he slowly began to interpret the world around him through a spirit sense. But as Asmodeus rises to greater and greater power, the world cries out for aid. Zhao Long takes up his staff and journeys westward in a bid to destroy the Mace of Tanis. I like staff guys, and Zhao Long is no different with big sweeping attacks and a decent fireball to keep enemies on their toes. However, teenage me was less than enamored with him since he was kind of placed as a gut check in the N64 arcade ladder where the game's difficulty jumped up, and I don't know, he doesn't have a flaming sword or nipple rings or anything, so I wasn't in love with the design. There's no arguing with results, however, and after vanquishing Asmodeus, he holds the mace in his hands and it calls to him. The mace promises to restore Xiao Long's sight, to provide him infinite wisdom and immortality that he may ponder every mystery of the world. But is it really a trap?
Yes, it was.
Already possessing great wisdom and appreciative of how the rest of his senses continue to perceive the world around him, Xiao Long destroys the mace and ends its influence over mankind. Even if Xiao Long were to lose, he simply returns home to meditate on his failures. Asmodeus can't have this and informs Xiao Long's father that his son yet lives. He relays this to the Khan, and outraged that the boy would insist on further insulting him by not having the good sense to just die, the Khan assembles an army and rides to the monastery. But the monks are ready. A climactic battle breaks out between the opposing forces, the outcome of which remains a mystery to this day. Xiao Long's good ending provides some interesting world building, with the mace talking to him and tempting him. We saw how Namira let her desire for revenge overtake her, but was that her attitude or an influence of dark powers? Are Mordos Kull and Ragnar truly benevolent rulers, stronger than the power of the Mace of Tanis and able to wield it for good? Or is it just biding its time until the 2020s where it once again can feed upon widespread plague and suffering? Takeshi and Ichiro Tsunami are brothers. The former is the final member of the main roster, the younger brother who became a great warrior and noble samurai, while the latter is a time-release secret character in the arcades who can be accessed via a code on console. Both wield a katana, but Takeshi is faster while his older brother is more deliberate and throws his hat. As eldest son, Ichiro was the inheritor of the family's estate and fortunes, but as he watched his younger brother gain notoriety as the youngest general in the Emperor's army, his envy grew. Ichiro left Japan in search of Asmodeus, a man who was rumored to grant impossible power to those willing to pay the price. He returned with an army, sacking the territories of lesser feudal lords in a bid to bring the Mace's influence to Japan. Disheartened by the dark path his brother had taken, Takeshi vowed to restore him to his former self and sought out Asmodeus. Ichiro, of course, has designs on taking the mace. Why borrow power when you can wield it wholesale? Win or lose, neither brother's endings are without tragedy. If Takeshi fails, he's forced to join Ichiro's army, but this doesn't last for long. Ichiro demands his brother conquer all of China, and rather than give him the satisfaction of seeing him fail, Takeshi commits ritual suicide on the steps of their family home, and in doing so becomes a romantic figure of Japanese legend. If Ichiro loses, he's betrayed by his closest men, who fear his manic abuse. They draw and quarter him, sending his parts to the four corners of the earth before enjoying a slightly less tyrannical rule of whoever replaces him. Even if he's successful, the mace brings him nothing but anguish. Takeshi escapes Ichiro's wrath and begins engaging in guerrilla warfare against his holdings. As Ichiro assumes the role of Emperor of Japan, he becomes so obsessed with finding his brother and destroying him that much of Japan is laid to waste in the process. Truly nothing can save Ichiro from his own madness. Even if Takeshi absconds with the mace to Lord Deimos' lava castle, casting it into the molten moat like the fires of Mount Doom, the resulting explosion of power disintegrates the elder brother, his soul too corrupt to save. Takeshi becomes godlike, bathed in golden light as he is empowered by the innumerable souls freed from the mace. And though Japan enters a golden age under his guidance, Takeshi is racked with the shame of his greatest failure forevermore.
Oh, crap!
So dwarves are a thing in this game. I mean, there's demons and magic and stuff to be fair, but for some reason squat bearded crafters living under the mountains is a few steps more toward the fantastic than I expected from the outset. Apparently, these people have been long enslaved by Lord Deimos, forced to smith weapons and armor for his minions. This would no doubt include Deimos' own flaming sword and the handsome flail that Mordos Kull received upon joining the mercenaries in his employ. But like any good autocrat, the working conditions set by Bavaria's answer to Sauron are cruel and oppressive. One such crafter, Gar Gudrunson, finds James Cameron-like inspiration in a nightmare full of fire and screams. Amidst the chaos, emerging victorious from a cloud of steam is a design of brass and wood that would finally free the dwarves from under Deimos' boot. The dwarves set to work building it, with Gar the only man whose burning passion could drive him to pilot the war mech. This thing is as glorious as it is stupid. With a steel barrel for one hand and a spiked mace for the other, the war mech attacks from all angles, spinning and smashing as Gar shouts enthusiastically from its barrel cockpit. Failure is a dangerous game in such a contraption, of course. Gar manages to escape the wreckage of his craft with his life, but his adamant determination to see Deimos and now Asmodeus defeated cause him to attempt more complicated and dangerous designs. Several dwarves lose their lives in the iteration process before Gudrunson himself finally perishes in a steam explosion. However, should he be successful, the war mech clutches the mace in its mace, and Gar is transfixed. He is treated to visions of upheaval, of dwarves living freely on the surface with humans subjugated under their rule. He returns to the halls of his mountain home and shows the Mace of Tanis to the rest of the dwarves, spurring them to similar conclusions. More mechs are constructed, and eventually the dwarves burst forth from the earth, sowing discord and pain with their march toward supremacy. Hell Knight is an interesting character, though you'd be forgiven for thinking he isn't, what with his name being Hell Knight and not like Grix or something. It turns out even the denizens of hell are tired of Asmodeus' shit, so Lucifer dispatches one of his soldiers to retrieve his Morning Star. Oh hey, I just got that.
Good for you!
Turns out using the mace is draining the dark energy that powers the Netherrealm, so off the Hell Knight goes, dual-wielding axe-like blades and shooting fireballs from his tail. Failure isn't really an option since Satan isn't notoriously understanding. With the alternative being divorced from his armor and left to slow roast in hell's fires for all eternity, the pan drippings of his corpse feeding the hex slugs or whatever kind of creature dwells below the bowels of the Inferno, the Hell Knight defeats Asmodeus and reclaims the mace. That's seriously it, job done. The Mace of Tanis is safely back on the Devil's Mantle with only the mild lingering threat of extra-dimensional portals being opened up as a result of its use. But that's Earth's problem, not the Hell Knight's. Another thing I like about the secret characters in this game is that a few of them have precedent in the story, like Ichiro and Sir Dragon. Especially with the arcade time released, it's almost like an early version of DLC. Originally a knight in the First Crusade, Dragon was killed by a soul-stealing axe, rendering him unable to find peace in the afterlife, and pulling him from the grave as a revenant. Seeing the potential of a rotting crusader, Asmodeus offered him a position as one of the seven, and Dragon agreed, digging holes and stealing souls to create an army of undead both at his direct command and also left to roam free to terrorize unwary travelers. Of course, what is evil without unnecessary treachery? It turns out Asmodeus knew the location of Dragon's soul this whole time, so he's taking up his sword and shield to defeat his former master. If Warmech and another forthcoming character weren't in the game, I'd call Sir Dragon the comedy fighter. He vomits up green corpse gas, does a little Dr. Boskanovich can-can kick and a spinning windmill attack, and his arm falls off during his victory pose. Despite this, he has some pretty good endings. Obviously his soul is contained within the Executioner's axe. Once it's destroyed and set free, he returns to his healthy, fabulous former glory. But with the sins he committed since his undeath, he is no longer welcome in the Kingdom of Heaven. So Dragon puts himself to work on Earth, thwarting evil and righting wrongs wherever he can. Should he fall to Asmodeus, he is instead imprisoned and his soul forced back into his body, along with the soul of each of his victims. Dragon spends eternity trying to find himself from the jumbled mess of anguish and torment inside him. It's a lot like being in your 30s. Alright, two more secret characters, both of them connected to Taria, but each very different in tone. The first is Grendel, the last challenge you face at the gates of Machu Picchu before arriving at Asmodeus' chamber. Much like the Executioner, he doesn't make the best use of his hammer's reach, but he does a lot of great shoulder charges and headbutts with those horns, and he looks frickin' awesome. Definitely an imposing guardian and a great lead into the final boss. Grendel only has the vaguest, shadowy memories of a family, of being something more than he is now, but to discover the truth he'd have to defeat Asmodeus and risk being turned into a malodorous dog-like gargoyle, without even the honor of being his master's greatest warrior. Still, some risks are worth the taking. If Grendel succeeds, his stony prison melts away to reveal Torres de Castillo, Taria's brother and the heir apparent to the Iberian throne. As he grasps the Mace of Tanis, suddenly the prophecy makes sense. Asmodeus had taken the right child, the one who would defeat his evil and bring hope to the people. Torres slays his father, but cannot bring himself to kill Taria. Yet she refuses to turn from the path of darkness, so he has her blinded and her tongue cut out so that she can no longer traffic with dark magics. Taurus becomes the most benevolent ruler the land has ever seen, leaving the evils of Asmodeus only a memory. And finally, to cap off this roster of heroes, monsters, and madmen, there's Pojo the Fighting Chicken. Literally, as I'm recording this, I realize that's a soft J, it's Poyo. Editing room Eric here, remembering that the announcer of the game calls her Pojo. It's a little debatable. He pronounces the J somewhere between the hard consonant and the soft Y sound, more like the Zh in Xiaolong. But he also pronounces Ichiro as Ichiro, and I mean, come on. The joke's right there. Pollo Spanish for chicken, Taria is a Spanish character. We're sticking with Pollo. Yes, I am being serious, this character exists. You can unlock Pollo with a little trick using Taria's fatality that turns her foe into a chicken, and then charge that chicken into battle. She fights like you would expect her to, with kicks, flaps, pecks, and an egg-launching projectile. She also has an amusing move where she surrounds herself with flames, because, you know, we cook and eat chicken. The cost of Pollo's failure is escape, going into hiding among normal chickens and living out her days on a farm. The beast earned Asmodeus' ire, however, and every time he sits down to chicken dinner, he hopes to recognize the bird he's about to devour as the once mighty Pollo. But we all know the true ending of Mace the Dark Age is in Pollo's victory. I don't know about you, but if I wrote a medieval sword fighting game, the canon climax would involve a particularly inspired chicken seizing all the power of the titular weapon. Taking it in her beak with a unique animation, Pollo grows giant-sized.
Mega Ultra Chicken.
The power of the mace has rooted itself in her chicken mind, you see. Whatever or whoever Pollo may have once been is gone, or perhaps never was there in the first place. All she wants is a good meal and a place to rest. But the mace has other plans. Now bearing the strength of 10,000 chickens, Pollo has developed a thirst for blood. She attacks villages by night, burning them with her flames and devouring the inhabitants, leaving nothing but ash. She is spoken of only in whispers, stories of a great winged beast descending from the heavens to lay waste to all in her path, emitting fire and swiping with terrible talons as people run in fear. They call it the dragon. I guess there's also an alternate attire for Zhao Long you can unlock called Ned the Janitor, but he doesn't actually have any lore, so I don't think that counts. He's pretty cool though. Janitors are cool. Or perhaps it's Janitors. There's also Spanky, come to think of it, the wooden trading dummy that you can use some cheats to sort of play. I'm honestly not even sure he'd bear mentioning if it wasn't for his unique and utterly 90s look. We really did want to beat up smiley faces back then, huh? Mace takes the things I love from the other games we've covered this year and rolls it up into a ball. Interconnected stories, creative character designs, dark humor, people from different backgrounds all over the world, and it even holds up pretty well on a technical level. The attacks are way slower than modern games, but compared to other 3D fighters at the time, it wasn't bad. Not nearly as bad as everyone back then seemed to believe, anyhow. I'd be over the moon if we got a remake or a sequel to the game, but it's been a long time. Midway isn't a company anymore, and instead of video games, Atari is now into, cryptocurrency. I'm not even sure who holds the license, so I'm not holding my breath. But that doesn't mean I can't dream. Thank you for watching Season 1 of Violent Profiles, all in one big collection. If you want to see more from this series or my work in general, head over to the Patreon and subscribe at the $5 tier. You'll join the illustrious ranks of the names currently on screen and earn my eternal gratitude. Thanks for watching. White out.